Hi, good morning. We're going to start in about 1 minute. Hi, good morning. Welcome. My name is Shlomo Weissman, Rabbi Shlomo Weissman. I serve as the Menahel, the director of the Beth of America. And it's a great honor and privilege to welcome you all here this morning. First of all, thank you to Congregation B'nai Yeshurun for co-sponsoring this event. Just before we start, just a few technical items before we start. First of all, I'd like to welcome the 100 people, I think it was 98 people last I checked, who are joining us online, in addition to this really beautiful showing this morning. Especially for the people online, there will be, for the CLE credit, at 2 points during the program, passwords or passcodes that will be shared with everyone. Obviously, take a note of that. For the people here in person, your attendance is recorded by your signing in and out. If you are here and hope to get CLE credit, it's very, very important that you do sign in and sign out. The CLE provider is not able to give credit to anyone who's not signed in at the beginning of the program and signed out at the end of the program. For the people joining us online, as I said, there will be 2 passcodes that will be shared, so look out for those. You can enter those passcodes and apply for the CLE credit by going to bethdin.org/codes. Again, that's only for the people online, bethdin.org/codes. For everyone, there are written materials that accompany this event. That's a CLE requirement, and those can be accessed at bethdin.org/materials. bethdin.org/materials. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Rabbi Elliot Schreier, who is going to introduce the event.
Good morning, everyone. I want to thank everybody for coming this morning, and I also want to express our appreciation in terms of the Basin of America for giving us the great honor, the great kavod and privilege of hosting this event this morning. I also want to thank some of our sponsors. Particularly, I want to thank the Weinstein family, David Weinstein, who's sponsoring in memory of the yard sites of Saul Hirth. Zan Valdov and Alexander, whose yard site is tomorrow. And Gladys Weinstein, Gittel Zan Valdov, whose yard site will be on the 24th of Adar. Of course, this morning we're celebrating the institution of Beis Din, and particularly the Beis Din of America. It's I could say personally, it's actually a great success for me to be hosting this event. Insofar as my Rebbe, Mordechai Willig, is the Av Beis Din, is now the Av Beis Din of the Beis Din of America, and it's important for us to understand the centrality of this institution in our lives. A lot of times, many of our communal institutions in Jewish life go unnoticed because we don't see them on a day-to-day basis. But the Beis Din of America is really a bedrock, foundational institution in Jewish life in America. In introducing our first speaker, Rav Asher Weiss Shlita, I accordingly wanted to quote from a Rambam in Helfand Sanhedrin pertaining to the institution of Beis Din and Dayanim in particular. At the very beginning of the second parak of Helfand Sanhedrin, the Rambam outlines the qualifications that were necessary for one to serve on the Beis Din Hagadol, on the Sanhedrin Hagadol in Yerushalayim. Rambam here is based on Gemaras at the end of the first parak of Sanhedrin and Dr. Tzayin. And he says that when you establish them, when you take somebody for the Beis Din, you need Anoshim Chachamim Unevonim, you need people who are exceedingly wise, Muflan B'Chachmas HaTorah, people who know the entirety of Torah, Ba'alei Deya Meruba, and again, they're people of immense intellectual capacity. Yodim Ktsas Mishar Chachmos Gon Refuos B'Cheshbon Tekupos U'Malzos B'Stagninos B'Darkei HaMe'onanim V'Hakosmin V'Hamachashvin V'Hevlei Abodazara V'Yotze Be'elu K'Deshiyu Yodin Ladonosam. Rambam says they have to know all sorts of other disciplines as well. They need to know medicine, the Rambam specifies. They need to understand science. The Rambam says they even need to understand Avodah Zarah so that they can paskin on questions pertaining to Avodah Zarah. They need a vast array of knowledge that exists outside the world of Torah in addition to their Torah mastery. Of course, like all Dayanim, people who serve on the Sanhedrin, need to be of the utmost moral character, of the greatest moral integrity. They need people to be people who love emes and justice, sona evotza, people who detest perversion of justice, and they need to be compassionate people as well. Rambam says that there are certain categories in Halacha Gimel, certain people who are excluded from the Beis Din because they potentially exhibit achzarius. They are people who are callous towards others. They don't have the requisite compassion that is necessary to feel the pain of others and to serve as a proper dayan. And you read these halachos at the beginning of the second parak of Sanhedrin, and you wonder how there was ever a Sanhedrin in Klal Yisrael, a Sanhedrin Gedolah, a Sanhedrin Katana. How was there ever enough people to meet those requisite standards? How was there ever anyone who met those requisite standards to serve on a Sanhedrin? And then you're zocha to be in the privilege of someone like Rav Weiss, Shlita. I mentioned in my drasha this past Shabbos that on Tuesday, I and many other Rabbanim from the tri-state area and really from around the country, many people flew in for the event, had the opportunity to gather together in the Young Israel Woodmere to learn Torah from Rav Weiss. And hearing Rav Asher offer guidance in matters of halacha, in matters of hashkafa, in matters of general communal import, and also being able to share personally reflections of his mother's Zichrono Livracha, it was really a beyond inspiring event. And indeed, perhaps you wonder how it was possible at one point in Klal Yisrael's history that they were able to find so many people. They were able to create a system of dayanim and batei din. But it is at least inspiring to know that even in our generation, even if we can't find 70 and more people who meet those standards, at least there are some who meet those standards among us. And accordingly, it is a tremendous privilege and success for us this morning to hear words of Torah from Rav Weiss.
First, I want to thank Rabbi Schreier for his generous and somewhat exaggerated introduction. And it is a simcha and a privilege to be here. I have many fond memories from this community. We've known each other for quite a while, for quite a few years. But this morning is really a very special event. As Rabbi Schreier noted, one of the most important institutions in Beis Yisrael is a Beis Din. And the Beis Din has many functions and many different realms of responsibility beyond the courts in modern society. Because the Beis Din bears responsibility not only in dealing justice bein odom lachaveroi, also bein odom lamokaim. The modern court deals with crime, doesn't deal with sin. But the responsibility of a Beis Din originally was not only l'asais tzedakah u'mishpat, but also lahamid et adat al tila, Beis Din makin v'yonshin. We live in a changing world. There no longer is a Beis Mikdash in Yerushalayim. And we also don't have the Beis Din HaGadol in Lishkas HaGazis in Yerushalayim. But still, Beis Din is central and essential to every Jewish community. To my dismay, many people prefer to turn to secular courts when they have monetary disputes. It is a phenomenon that cannot and should not be justified, but it needs to be understood, because you can't fight something if you don't understand it. And sometimes we could understand people that prefer to turn to secular courts. I think most people know that that is a very harsh transgression. And the language the Shulchan Aruch uses, following the footsteps of the Rambam, against those that turn to secular courts is unparalleled. Nowhere does the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch use such harsh language. Meirem yad b'toras Moshe, koifer be'ikar, and people still turn to secular courts because by many there is some fundamental mistrust in the Beis Din system. Most of the times unjustified, but once again, understandable. People go to Basin, they don't know what to expect. And not all of what they did conduct their proceedings in a proper manner. It is not uncommon for one party to learn to a chagrin that a Dayan spoke personally with another party. So in order to see to it that people turn to Botei Din and not the secular courts, we need proper Botei Din. The Yonim that try to rise to the standards of the Rambam and Perek Beis Melchus and Hedron. Maybe very few could really achieve those standards, but we need to try, and we need to try to emulate the Dayanim and the giants of yore. So for me, it is a privilege and a schus to partake in this morning, which is a celebration of the Basin of America and the appointment of Rabbi Willig to be the Av Basin. I've known Rabbi Willig for many years, and he is a paragon, really an immense Talmud Chacham, a person of vast wisdom, sensitivity, and I think Ra'ui hu la'oisa itztala v'keser Torah cholam masai. So I don't think Rabbi Willig is here. Is he here with us this morning? I did not see him, but I don't want to use the words congratulations. It's not a Jewish expression, but my brachas, my heartfelt brachas, and I wish for Rabbi Willig and for the Beis Din, he should have many, many, many wonderful years standing at the head of this great institution. And I was asked this morning to speak about the concept of pshora, and I was told that most of the people gathered in this room are lawyers. Is that so? Some of the people I know are rabbonim and dayanim. I hope there are some lawyers in our audience this morning, but regardless, it's a fascinating sugya. So when should Beis Din try to convince the parties to go for a pshora? And at what stage of the proceedings is that permissible? The source of the sugya is in Sanhedrin Daf Vav. Reb Shimon ben Manasseh maintains that pshora is legitimate only up to the stage in which the Beis Din yodeya lahechan hadin noteh. Beis Din should recommend to parties, maybe you want to work out a compromise instead of asking the Beis Din to go for the approach of Yikov Din et Hahar. But if Beis Din already has the feeling, they heard both parties, and the Beis Din has the feeling who is right and who is wrong, they can no longer recommend the pshara. But the Chachamim maintain, Kol zman shelo nigmar hadin, until the verdict is finally passed, pshara is legitimate and should be recommended. And that is the Halacha in Shulchan Aruch, Semen Yud Beis, Seif Beis. Actually, there are two different Seifim in Shulchan Aruch which relate to pshara. Semen Yud and Choshen Mishpat Seif Aleph, Semen Yud Beis, Seif Beis. And in Semen Yud, Seif Aleph, Shulchan Aruch writes, Kol ha-moineya atzmoi min hadin, moineya mimeno gezel eva v'shavu hashav. Mazel tov, Rabbi Willig. So I am not in charge here. I'm just a guest, but the best of my humble understanding, I should be sitting up here. Please, I want company up here. It's not good to be up here alone. So you came just in time after I finished speaking about you. So in Semen Yud, the Shulchan Aruch says, Kol ha-maneya atzmoi min hadin, moineya mimeno. Good morning, Rabbi Reiss. I didn't notice that you're here, so I apologize. כל המניע עצמו מן הדין, מונע ממנו איבה וגזל ושבוע שווא. And the Sma explains, what do you mean כל המניע עצמו מן הדין? Just run away from Beis Din? No. Recommend pshora. Simen Yud Beis Siv Beis, Shulchan Aruch says, Kol Beis Din she'oise pshora tamid, arei ze mishubach. Does that mean that Beis Din always needs to try to impose pshora or recommend pshora? Sma, Simen Yud Beis, Siv Kot Nevav, when the Shulchan Aruch says arei ze mishubach, and the beginning of the Sif is when the parties walk into the basin room, the basin needs to ask the parties, do you prefer din or would you like pshora? So the Shulchan Aruch seems to say they just need to be given the options without any influence or recommendation or trying to pressure them one way or the other. They just need to know that they have two options. Imle din, imle pshora. But the Sma's interpretation is that no, we should recommend pshora. And that is also the opinion of the Shachter and Sif Kot and Gimel. The Taz says no, they should be given the options, not beyond that. And that is also the opinion of the Tumi, Rabbi Yonah and Purim, Sif Kot and Dalet. And that is what the Taz quotes from the Maharal. However, both sources in Shulchan Aruch that I quoted seem to indicate, yes, we should always try to go for a pshora and not say Yikov Adin Es Hahar. The Mechilta in Pashas Mishpotim, and I'm quoting the Lashon of the Mechilta, Yirei Elokim Oisim Pshora B'Din. So obviously, Chazal, even though they were giants of Torah, were very afraid of Asiyas Din. And that is why the Mechilta says people that have Yiras Hashem should try to refrain from Din and recommend Pshora. We find the same in the Marshon, Sanhedrin, Avavam, and Beis. The Avnei Nezer, had somewhat of a split personality in the most positive way. He was the founder of a Hasidic dynasty. He was the Sachach of a Rebbe. He was also one of the greatest Gedolim of his time, an amazing Ilui. And the Avnei writes, in my life, I never paskin al pidin, and I always recommended and try to bring the parties to a pshora. However, we really need to think whether this is so strongly to be recommended, especially in our times. And I think a basin there will always try a Shiva Pshora. Nivnu oisei resha, and people might take advantage. You claim a person, you know that your claim is ridiculous, you know it's a lie, and you trust, well, I'll get something out of it. The basin will recommend a Pshora, and we are encouraging wrongdoing. So I think it is only in specific cases in which pshora is justified. In the vast majority of cases, Beis Din needs to paskin in accordance to Choshen Mishpat. And one of the reasons that drive people to secular courts is the assumption in Beis Din they will not really do justice. They will always try to work out the pshora, and to my detriment if you really think you're right. So I think we live in a changing world in many different areas and many different aspects, and in this aspect as well. When people were to me mistake, and they didn't come to Beis Din unless there actually was some basis for a claim, maybe pshora should be recommended. I think in our day and age, the primary goal of a Beis Din is tzedek u'mishpat, and to paskin. There are so many boti din in which the Yoram are not really versed in Choshen Mishpat at all. And the reason they dare to sit in Beis Din is because, well, we're not learning Choshen Mishpat anyway. We're not paskining up Yalach anyway. We just try to work out some compromise. All you need is some common sense. and sometimes even that ingredient is lacking. But the feeling that all we need to do is just work out a pshara is a mistake, and it is one of the factors that brings people to go to secular court. And people also take advantage of the system. And a person knows, I don't really have any sound claim, but probably I'll get something out of it because the person will try to work out a pshara. And therefore, I think that the primary duty of Boti Din in our day and age, they need to be versed in Choshev Mishpat, they need to be versed in Eben Ezer, they need to know the subject material, and they need to paskin according to Choshev Mishpat and in accordance to halacha. So when is pshara justified? So I want to specify 3 different areas and 3 different scenarios in which pshara is the right course of action. Shuvas Harashim and Klal Kuf Zayin Siman Vav. The Rosh appears more than once in the Shuvas, but probably that is the most important Shuva, and it is quoted in Siman Yud Beis Hey in Choshev Mishpat. Ein hadayonim rishoim lehestalek min hadin. And if a case comes before Beis Din, and Beis Din really is in doubt, and they don't really know what to make of it, and they can't decide who is right and who is wrong. Sometimes the doubt is based on halachic doubt, sfeikis and halacha. Sometimes they can't really decide who speaks truth and who is not truthful. And they can't really decide what has transpired between the 2 parties. So is a Beis Din entitled to say, I don't know, and therefore nestalik min hadin? Maybe al pi halacha that would be an option. The other option would be hamotzim mechaveri olav haraya, and the muchzik is the one that goes home happy, and the Rosh says no, because the Beis Din has a dual duty, not only mishpat, but also lasei shalom ba'olam, and to enhance peace and harmony. So when people come to Beis Din in discord and they have a monetary dispute, they're supposed to walk out of the Beis Din when Beis Din decides and decrees, and the tafka of the Beis Din is also lasei shalom ba'olam, and to bring peace and harmony and quiet into our communities, and therefore the Beis Din eino rashai lehistalek min hadin, and in that case, he needs to try to achieve a pshara. We find the same reasoning in Shuvas Baz, and that Baz was a generation younger than the Rosh. In Shuvas Baz, Chelik Dalet Siman Nun Dalet, that Baz says, what is the Beis Din supposed to do if he cannot decide? He's supposed to turn to a greater Beis Din than he is and ask the counsel of others, or speak to Talmidei Chachamim and try to understand and reach a verdict. And if he still cannot do so, if it's a Safek Gomer, he should do a pshara. Chazal do not base the concept of pshara on the pasuk v'asiso hayoshev ha'toiv. There are various different halachas that Chazal do base on v'asiso hayoshev ha'toiv. For instance, Dina de Bar Metzah, Shuma Hadra Liyolam. These are sugyas and Bava Mitzvah. But the Radbaz alludes pshara to v'osiso hayoshev ha'toiv. So when Beis Din cannot really decide, and Beis Din is in doubt, the Rosh and the Shuvas Radbaz say, in that case, pshara is recommended. Shavos Yankov goes a step further. Chelik Beisim and Kuf Memhei, and the Shavos Yankov was one of the great poskim going back more than 300 years. And he says sometimes, even if Beis Din does not have a suffix, and they're not in doubt, and if Beis Din feels that paskening al pi Choshev Mishpat would just cause a deepened rift and machlokes, sometimes lasei shalom is more important than doing justice. And Beis Din in that case has the right to recommend a pshora and even to impose a pshora. That is the Shvus Yankev, Chelik Beis, Simen Kuf, Mem, Hey. Sometimes, and this will sound strange to many people, that I don't think it would sound strange to the esteemed Yonim sitting on my left, sometimes there is a contradiction between tzedek and mishpat. It could happen. Sometimes if we say, Yikov adin sahar, but we know that the righteous person and the one that was honest in his dealings will lose out, and we are encouraging and supporting wrongdoing. I cannot give examples because they're complex. That what is Basin supposed to do when there is an obvious clash between mishpat and yashar? So I quoted the pasuk before. V'osiso hayashar v'hatoiv. Is yashar v'toiv the same? Maybe not always the same. Tzedek and mishpat, are they the same? I think two sides of the same coin, but not always do they coincide. And one of the most important ingredients that is required from a dayan is chush hatzedek, the feeling of what's right and what's wrong, not only being versed in chush and mishpat, but having the feeling what is right and what is wrong, what is evil and what is righteous. And pshora is justified when mishpat contradicts tzedek. I don't know exactly how to translate mishpat and tzedek. Mishpat is probably justice, ruling. How would you translate tzedek?
Righteousness. Righteousness.
Yeah, righteousness is tzidkus. I don't know whether it's tzedek, but anyway, I'm speaking to Talmidei Chachamim here, and even the left side of this room are Talmidei Chachamim. So everybody knows what mishpat is and what tzedek is, and when mishpat and tzedek do not coincide, pshora is justified, and this is something that we learn from Chuvas Ma'ari Barona in two different sources. Simen Reish Mem Aleph and Simen Reish Mem Hey. Simen Reish Mem Aleph, he deals with the concept of Groma ben Ezikin Potor. And this is somewhat of a problematic concept. So in Shas Chuvas Minchas Osher, I do not remember which volume and I don't remember which siman. And I am constantly apologizing. I remember many Sforim better than I remember Minchas Osher, and that is for a very simple reason. To me, Minchas Osher is not Gersa Diankuta. When I was young, Sefer wasn't available. And that is why I remember the Tzais and the Nesivos and some Sefer far better than I remember Minchas Osher. I do remember that I printed a tshuva. I do not remember which volume, don't remember which seven, but I wrote a great arichas about the difference between garmi and groma, and I am machmir b'groma v'nasikin, broadening the concept of dina de garmi, which is chayiv. But Marie Brona says, by groma v'nasikin, a person did something bad, and he very clearly caused loss and damage to another party. But it's groma. It's indirect, and therefore he is potter. If Beis feels it is right, they should impose a pshora. That is Marie Brona Siman Reish Mem Aleph, and Reish Mem Hey, he speaks about chiyuv l'tzeis yedei shamayim. So Mishpat says, can't force him to pay, but Tzedek says, chiyuv l'tzeis yedei shamayim. It is another case in which pshora is justified. And finally, a totally different concept of pshora, even though Chazal used the same term, pshora. And if we would have time, I would bring many sources. Sometimes we find the same term in Chazal, two different sources, and it means two different things. Not always does the same word have the same meaning. So usually pshora is compromise. And compromise is justified, as I explained, either when we want to achieve harmony or when we want to achieve tzedek. Compromise is justified when Beis Din is in doubt, and it's a suffix. So instead of saying which would cause discord and machloikis, and not always is it doing justice, compromise is recommended. But on all the sources I quoted up to this point, pshora means compromise. Sanhedrin and Lamed Beis and Ksubis Tzadikei are two sugyas in which pshora does not really mean compromise based on any of the principles we dealt with in the last half hour. So tzedek tirdoif echod ledin ve'echod lepshora. That is the source of pshora in the eyes of Chazal, not vosis vayot shel hatoif. Tzedek tirdoif. Why does the pasuk use the same word twice? Echod ledin ve'echod lepshora. So first of all, we learn from this drasha that pshora is not external. Pshora is part of the legitimate process of Beis Din, and pshora is included in the pasuk tzedek tirdoif echod ledin ve'echod lepshora. And then Chazal give us an surprising case of pshora. Shnei gemalim oilem b'malas beis chorion, or shtei sfinois, two huge ships need to pass the Panama Canal, and each in a different direction, from north to south, from east to west, or from west to east. I don't know the exact geography, but it's, it is from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So, who comes first? Two camels in a narrow passage in the mountains. If each of them insists on having his way, one of the two, maybe both, would fall off the cliff and fall to their deaths. So what do? So Chazal say, Tu'una v'sha'ena tu'una, the one that carries a heavy burden has the first right to pass, and the one that carries no burden will patiently wait. Is that pshora? And the Meiri says that is only one possibility. One carries a burden and the other does not carry a burden. One has a long way to go and the other is very close to its destination. The one that has a longer way to go has the first right. The Meiri says if one carries a sick person and the other does not, which means we apply common sense and the feeling of what is right and wrong, and he has the first right to pass. Shneim te'unim. Both have a long way to go. Both carry a burden. What do we do then? Oisim pshora beineim v'malim sachar zeh lezeh. So, if we have no reason to put one before the other, they both have a long way to go. They both carry a heavy burden. So who has the right to pass first? So we do a pshora and we auction, who is willing to pay. Give me $100 and I'll let you go first. And, we negotiate. So in this Gemara, we have two different types of pshora. I think the first one is based on morality, on ethics, like the pshoras we mentioned before. But the second one is just bred from necessity. It's not one is right and one is wrong, and it's not really a compromise. It's negotiations. It's a deal. But Chazal call it a pshora. Why is it called a pshora? Because it's not based on din. We don't have any yardstick. We don't have any formula to say who's right. Both are right. Both are wrong to insist that they want the first away. So this is not din, and therefore it is defined as pshora. But it is a pshara that is bred not by morality, by ethics, but rather by necessity, sheer necessity. We can't let them fight it out because both might perish. We need to decide. And therefore, if there is no ethical way to decide, then it's a pshara, but not the same nature of pshara as all the others we mentioned. It's just negotiating a deal, and the one that's willing to pay has the right to be first. We find a similar sugi in Ksubis Tzaddik Heyom Midbeis. Person has two wives. He married one before the other, and then he sold the field. And Ksubis Usha Goiva Mina Mishua Bodim. So both of these women have a right to go to the lekuchos, to the purchaser, and take the field because their loan comes before his purchase, and they have nechosim mishua bodim. Wife number one wrote a shtar to the purchaser, din v'dvorim einli orlecho. That means wife number one was moichel her schus, her entitlement to get that field. But the second wife doesn't have a similar document. So lady number two takes the field from the purchaser. Now lady number one could take it away from lady number two, because my shivud comes before yours. And now the purchaser could take it back from lady number one, because we have an agreement, I come before you. So the purchaser comes before wife number one, wife number two comes before the purchaser. Wife number one comes before wife number two. Chayzer cholila, chayzer v'chalila. The Mishnah says chayzer cholila. So what do? Oisem pshora v'malan schar zeh lezeh. Who's right? No one is right. No one is wrong. They're all right. So once again, Chazal called this a pshora. This is not a pshora bred by ethics over any moral principle. It's just bred by necessity. This could go on forever. And in Dina Mumanis, they're all right. And therefore, you're going to pay, you're going to need to work this out, some monetary agreement to make everybody happy. And that is once again called pshora. So this is what I have to say about pshora. I just want to go back to the most important point we made today. I think it is a real mistake for Botetin to decide we are actually a body of compromise, of gishur. I think that is one of the reasons people would prefer to go to courts and not to Beis Din. And I think it also will encourage wrongdoing. And therefore, I think we need to give the option to the parties if they want a pshara. That's the Shulchan Aruch, and we can't stray from that. But unless both parties are willing to go for a pshara, our tafkid is try to give a psak based on halacha, based on kosher mishpat. But there are cases, primarily three different scenarios, which I explained, in which pshara will be recommended and pshara will be justified. So I once again, first of all, want to give my humble brachas to Rav Willig. I hope for many, many, many years you will head this Beis Din and be Mekadosh Shem Shemayim. I am a Av Beis Din myself for the past 20 years. And I know sometimes it is an unpleasant job. So there is a saying, it's not a Jewish saying, but kitchens are Jewish. And the saying goes, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. And being an Av Beis Din, sometimes you get a lot of heat. Sometimes it's intense heat. But if you conduct your affairs in a fair way and the parties feel they had a say and it was fair, most of people, I believe, will be makabelas adin ba'avo. So many years ago, you know, when I sat in the basement room and the parties came in, and I don't know in advance who the people will be, I said, Oy vey, I know one of the people in many years, and he's a very, very tough individual. very tough individual. I only hoped that he will come out winning. I hoped, but I could do nothing more than hope. As it turned out, he lost entirely, and I did not think there was room for a pshara, for a compromise. The claim was $250,000, and we paskined he needs to pay that money in full. We didn't give him a break, not even 1 cent, and the entire claim was accepted. And the psak was he needs to pay $250,000, and I was convinced that I bought myself an enemy, and he's a tough person. But once again, if this is something you can do, you should never be sitting in a basement. Few months transpired. Erev Rosh Hashanah, I get a phone call. It is my dear friend that I know for so many years. And he says, Koi Darav, I still think I was right. And the basin made a mistake, and I interrupted him. And I said, it might very well be. We're human. Human beings are not always right. And I told him, maybe you were right, but I hope that you saw that the process was fair and we heard you out. So he says, Rebbe, I think I was right, but I want to tell you, I was Makayim, the psak, Kiksovay, Bechol Shoinoi, and I saw tremendous Yata Deshmaya in my business dealings. And in a few months, I made back the entire sum that I needed to pay. So thank you. I told them so many people called me before Rosh Hashanah to wish me a good Gebench, but your call means more to me than all the others that I got this year. And I really was moved. I was moved, and sometimes when people see that the process is erlich and it's fair, and even though they think I was right, and most people will think they were right. Most people always think they're right. I, Agav, don't think he was right, but I humbly said, maybe we're human, and we all need to recognize our shortcomings. Arrogance is a very bad trait for anyone and for the Yonam as well. But I think most people will be makabalas in Ba'abo. And I know that the Basin of America is one of the best Botidim. And I know that the Yonam is sitting in the basin. So I once again want to wish you Todim din emes la'amito. And if a person is not din emes la'amito, nasa shutav kadosh la'kodesh bochum asabashas. And this once again proves the importance and the centrality of Basin. Because Dayan Hadan din emes la'amito nasa shutav la'kodesh bochum asabashas. So it's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I need to rush because in a half hour I'm giving another shiur at the Chemet conference. It was a pleasure to be with you this morning, and I look forward to many more opportunities. Shitizkula Kadeshem Shemayim.
You're welcome.
We're going to continue the program if everyone can be seated. For the people who are joining us online, the passcode for the CLE is kitchen. Kitchen. Make sure to write it down. You could enter the passcode after the program is finished at bethlehem.org/code. The passcode is kitchen. That's the first passcode. If everyone can please be seated, we're going to continue the program.
Wait outside. Wait outside. You're gonna come outside. Don't want to get out.
He wasn't. He's in the kitchen.
Please be seated. Please take your seats.
Okay, we're going to continue the program. If anyone's getting refreshments, please do so. Please do so while I am speaking, but before our next speaker. I just want to quickly reiterate what an immense plus it is for us to be hosting this event. And I said what a plus it is for me personally before Willig got here. That will just quickly reiterate that point. Rebbe, I will say that I do not feel probably like Rav Usher to give words of bracha to my own Rebbe, but on the contrary, I will say on the opposite end of the spectrum as a Talmud that I personally feel so blessed, and we feel so blessed. It's a bracha for us to have had, to have, and to continue to have Rav Willig as a Rebbe and as a Moreh Hora'ah for our community. I can regale the audience for hours with personal stories of Rav Willig's greatness. I will not do so this morning. Thank you. But I will suffice by very shortly saying, Ashreinu sheyesh lanu Rebbe kazeh, Ashreinu sheyesh lanu av beistin kazeh. We should all be aware of what a supposed that is. When people think about this coming week's parsha, Parshas Vayakhel, we often don't think of Beistin as a primary or central theme in the parsha. Parshas Vayakhel is primarily about the construction of the Mishkan and all the details of the construction of the Mishkan. But Beistin is such a central and ubiquitous concept that indeed, if you just approach the parsha with a subtle eye, you will realize that Beistin appears right at the beginning of this week's parsha as well. Rashi, on the very first pasuk of Parshas Vayakhel, says that the date in which everybody gathered to build the Mishkan was the day after Yom HaKippurim. And the Kliyakar on the Parsha notes that according to Rashi's chronology, that's actually not the only thing that happened on that significant day. Kliyakar notes that Rashi at the beginning of Parshas Yisro says the day in which Yisro came to Moshe Rabbeinu and saw him judging the entire Jewish people, the day in which Yisro gave him advice on how to structure the court system so that Moshe Rabbeinu himself wouldn't be sitting all day judging all the cases, so that there wouldn't be long lines for everybody waiting to receive their din. That also happened on Motzai Yom HaKippurim. It happened on the very same day. And the Kliyakar offers several reasons why he thinks it was important for those two things to happen on the same day. He highlights the importance of Shalom for the Mishkan, that Rav Asher Shlita was highlighting a moment ago. But I would suggest on a broader level, it also highlights just how central Beistin is to Shechina. Before you can enter the Mishkan, before you can achieve Shechina, you need to have Batei Din first. You need to have a system of din that can properly offer Hora'ah to the people. Without that, you can't step into the Kodesh HaKadoshim and expect to experience Hashem Shechina in any direct way. Lama li rov zivteitem yomar Hashem. Hashem says, before you start to step into the Mishkan, you need Batei Din first. And on another level, it highlights something significant about the person who was running both of these events, both the Din and the Mishkan, and that is Moshe Rabbeinu. And in that sense, I think it's actually a really appropriate Kliyakar in the introduction of our next speaker, Hershel Shachter, Shlita. We often think of Moshe Rabbeinu in many ways. We know that he was a great leader. We know that he was a miracle worker. We know that he was a teacher of Torah to Yehoshua and the Zikanim. We know that he was a teacher of Torah to the masses. But what the Kliyakar reminds us is that before any of those things, Moshe Rabbeinu was a dayan. Moshe Rabbeinu spent his 9 to 5 or longer than 9 to 5, min haboker ad ha'arev. He spent his day judging cases. And it was through that hora'ah that Moshe Rabbeinu was able to achieve all else that he was able to achieve. Of course, in the history of Klal Yisrael, we have only had one Moshe Rabbeinu, but within our community, and when I say our community, I don't just mean Bnei Yeshurun, I mean our broader community. There is one individual, there's one Rav who has ascended to the title of Rabbeinu with a capital Reish, if you will. It is Rav Shachter Shlita. Rav Shachter embodies so many of the traits that the Kli Yakar highlights. He is a teacher of Torah to our Zakenim. You just need to look at many Talmidim of Rav Shachter who have themselves been Olam L'Gdula, who have become leaders of Klal Yisrael in their own right. He's a teacher of Torah to the masses. You just need to look at yutorah.org or the many shiurim that Rav Shachter gives to lay audiences to see how he has educated the masses as well. He's someone who, like Moshe Rabbeinu, is always willing to give his time to anyone. Any boy in the yeshiva knows that they could approach Rav Shachter at the front of the base medrash to ask questions. And so many people with personal needs and Niyim approach Rav Shachter all the time. Sometimes it falls upon others to play the role of Yisrael, but Rav Shachter is always willing to give of his time. And it starts with the Horah that he offers us constantly. Rav Shachter is somebody who gives us the ability to access the Shekhinah through his Horah. Through Rav Shachter, we are all able to enter our forms of Mishkan and access our connection to the Shekhinah. And accordingly, it's a great source for us to hear words of Torah from Rav Shachter.
Thank you very much. Many years ago, before the President of America became more active in Dinei Torah, the practice would often be that Balabatim would come to the base medrash on a Sunday. They would pick the first three rebbes they would bump into, and they would have it in Torah. And the truth of the matter is that if they would go to any yeshiva and pick the first three rebbeim that they bump into, they get the same psak. Whether it's Wayu or Chaim Berlin or Torah Vodas, it's got to be the same psak. It's the same Shulchan Aruch. Everybody learns the same way. There aren't so many differences of opinion over here. I remember once Rabbi Benji Yuden came on a Sunday afternoon with two Balabatim from his community. They had both invested in some real estate in California. They had some kind of a dispute between the two of them over several $1 million, as I seem to recall. And the rabbi didn't want to get involved. They both davened in his shul. So he brought them both to the yeshiva. So they picked the first three rabbanim that they bumped into. I sit right next to the door. So I was one of the three. And then another two. We had a dinner and we convinced them that they should agree for Pshara. I'll speak about that in a minute. And then when they presented the case, so there wasn't so much to deliberate about. So we paskin 100% in favor of one of them. That was the din and that was the Pshara. There was nothing to pilpul about. And they shook hands. They were friendly with each other. They remained friends, I think. And they thanked the Rabbanim. I remember there was one occasion where there was a sichsuk between a rabbi who was the principal of a day school in upstate New York and the board. The board was very upset with the rabbi. They wanted to fire him. I don't remember all the details. And the rabbi came with a towing. So we said, we don't allow any towing. You just tell us your version of the story and we'll tell you what the din is. We don't need the towing to tell us what he thinks the din is. We don't need the towing to embellish what the details of the case are. So the rabbi gave his version of the story. The Balabatim gave their version. And we paskin in favor of the Balabatim. 20 years later, I was in Florida to speak for some Tzedakah organization. And on Shabbos, I davened in one of the shuls. So they had a kiddush after Musaf. So some of the people in the shul came over to me. They were from the members of the board of that yeshiva, where we paskin in their favor against the rabbi. They said he still can't get over it. That they thought for sure the Bezdin is going to paskin in favor of the rabbi. I said, no, the Bezdin paskin, whoever is right. You have to paskin in favor of the one who's right. Unfortunately, in that situation, right after the Din Torah was over, we had to rip up all of our notes because the rabbi was a criminal. He was cheating the government. And we had written down all the information and he didn't deny it. So we were afraid that we may be called into court to testify because we heard all about this scandalous Geneva shtick. He was collecting unemployment when he had a job in Canada. And he was coming back to upstate New York every Shabbos. So the people in New York didn't realize he had a full-time job. And so we had to rip up all of our notes, we forget all the detail. I don't remember anybody's name. I don't remember what, I just remember he was a gunner. And that's why we passed him against him. The Gemara has a machlokes hatanoim, 3 opinions regarding pshara. One opinion is it's prohibited to recommend pshara because the Torah tells us what the dinim are. We have to follow the halacha. What do you mean pshara? This is the ethical way to go. The Torah tells you what the din is. That's the ethical way. Second opinion is no. It's permissible to recommend the pshara, but it's not necessary. It's not a chiyuv. And the third opinion is the way we paskin, that it's a mitzvah to recommend pshara. Why is it a mitzvah to recommend pshara? The Gemara says, it could be that Rabbi Weiss spoke about this before. The Gemara says that both parties will be happier. If you make a pshara, they'll both be happy. Today, there's another consideration why we recommend pshara, because we're not so convinced that we know the halacha so well. So we may be making a mistake in psak. So if you recommend pshara, you can't say you made a mistake. A pshara is a psak of lifnim, pshara sadid. What does Yosha dictate? So that's very subjective. So if the 3 members of the Bezdin think that Yosha dictates this way, so you can't say that they made a mistake. In fact, Shulchan Aruch, it says halacha l'maisa that when they have a pshara, you don't go basaroy. You don't say if it's a din, it's a real din Torah. And 2 say Reuben is chayv, and 1 says Reuben is pater. So then you go basaroy. The Torah says achram lahantis. We assume that the odds are that the 2 are right and the 1 is wrong. But in a pshara, you can't say the 1 is wrong. He's telling you what he feels subjectively, what Yosha dictates. From his perspective, he's right. From the other 2 perspectives, they're right. So you can't go basra. Din is in a pshara, you have to have the unanimous vote. I remember I was once at a din Torah. And also, a rabbi was in a congregation for many, many years, and the Balabatim were complaining. He's saying over the same drushes every year. It's time to retire. He's not preparing any drush. He just says over the same. They want to have a change. So strictly speaking, if the rabbi is not merutza l'kol, he's not allowed to continue function. Rabbi Soloveitchik used to tell Rabbanim when they wanted to have a din Torah with the Balabatim about staying in their positions, they said, if you want to have din Torah, don't ask me to be one of the dayanim. I will pass against you. Because the din is, you can only man as someone a parnas ala tzibur if the tzibur is merutza. So it doesn't help that merutza for the last 60 years. 60 years later, he's no longer merutza. They already heard all of his rushes, and they're not excited when he speaks. It's very unfortunate. Rabbis in shuls and rabbis in yeshivas sometimes don't realize that it's time to step down. So it's unfortunate that you have to have it in Torah. Anyway, so I remember on that occasion, so they agreed that they're going to have both parties agreed they're going to go for a pshara. So it was a case of Zablo. So the shul couldn't get any rabbi to agree to be their boirer. How can a rabbi paskin against another rabbi? So no one agreed. So they pressured me, so I agreed to be the boirer for the shul. So the boirer for the rabbi was very forceful, and he insisted the pshara should be one way. So I said, I don't agree. So the third one was the third guy, and the shalish was very easygoing. So he was going to go along with the other one. So I said, but you can't outvote me because in a pshara, you don't go basarayv. So the other forceful bird said he never heard of that. So the third one was Shmerel Shulman. So he said, what do you mean you never heard that? So the Pharisee did, and Shulchan Aruch, the president started rattling off all of our cuts. If they would, sometimes the parties agree in advance to pshara, and then they agree explicitly to go basarayv in the pshara. But in this case, they didn't agree. They just agreed to go for pshara. They didn't say they agreed to go basarayv. So I said, you can't outvote me because it's a pshara. I don't agree. So I paralyzed them until they came down to a reasonable pshara. Unfortunately, sometimes you have to do that. Rabbi Soloveitchik used to point out that a pshara doesn't mean a compromise 50-50. I say you owe me $100,000 and you say you owe zero, so you make him pay $50,000. Pshara means a psak of lifnim mishura sadin. And that siman in Shulchan Aruch and Choshen Mishpat, the Rama quotes in Machlokes Harishonim, whether you kofa on Pshara, whether you kofa on the Flim Mishur Sadin. The Flim Mishur Sadin is one of the dinim in the Torah. So let's say a Jewish person doesn't want to shake the lulav on Sukkot, he doesn't want to sit in Sukkot, doesn't want to eat matzah on Pesach. So the Gemara says you force him to. If he doesn't agree, so you beat him up. Makanot such a takes enough. You beat him up till he agrees to shake the lulav and to eat the matzah and so on. So what about Pshara? Pshara is one of the dinim in the Torah. Some of the Rishonim count it as in one of the 613 mitzvahs. You don't count it as one of the 613 mitzvahs, but it's one of the dinim. Even if it's not counted as a mitzvah, not everything that you're obligated to do is counted as a mitzvah. So how come you're not koifa am Pshara? Koifa and all the other mitzvahs, why not koifa am Pshara? So what they usually say is that if a person is forced into doing lifnim b'shura sadin, he won't be outside the mitzvah. Lifnim b'shura sadin is only if you do it b'nediva salev, if you're happy about it. If you agree to go, if they beat me up till I eat the matzah and I'm unhappy, the end of the day I ate the matzah. They beat me up till I shake a lulav. I'm not happy about shaking the lulav, but I shook the lulav. So I did the mitzvah even though I'm unhappy. Even though I'm in a miserable mood, and I'm not happy about shaking the lulav. But if I'm not happy about giving over the money in the pshara, so I'm not going to say anything. So they'll be kai for me, and I won't be mekayim any mitzvah of them. You're only out to the mitzvah if you do b'nediva saleh. So that's perhaps why we're not kai for pshara. So you have to have that the party should agree. But once they agree to go for pshara, then Mr. Yosef quotes the Rishonim who say that the psak is binding because it's a psak halacha. Not because the Gemara says pshara tzricha kinyan. The Gemara Sanhedrin, the Abba now says pshara needs, you have to make a kabbalah kinyan with the both parties. So it doesn't mean we made a kabbalah kinyan when you give a handkerchief, when you give a suitor. So you can in halacha, in secular law, they tell me there is no such thing. You can't obligate yourself to pay money that doesn't correspond to anything. I didn't break your window and I didn't borrow any money. I just obligate myself out of the clear blue sky to give you a fortune of money. So they tell me in secular law there is no such thing, but in halacha there is. If you make a kinyan surah, you make a kinyan shtar. I write in the shtar, if I obligate myself to give you $100,000, I give you the shtar, that creates a chayvus yesh me'ayin. So here the kabbalah's kinyan that you do in advance is not that by obligating myself, by making the kinyan, I obligate myself to pay you in the event that the bezin will say that I have to pay. No. Tyson says over there, the kinyan suit is just to demonstrate that you really mean it, b'leiv shalom. You agreed to go lifnim mishura sadin, even though strictly speaking you're not obligated. Maybe they can't pressure, they have no right to force you to go lifnim mishura sadin, but you're agreeing b'leiv shalom that you're going to go lifnim mishura sadin. Once you agree and the bezin gives a psak, the psak is binding because a psak halacha is binding. There's a psak of din and there's a psak of yosher. So they can't force you to go for Yosher, but once you agree, b'leiv shalom, to go for Yosher, then the psak is binding. The case is closed. The Gemara has an expression in Yevamot, Beidina basa beidina loidakis. And the context of the Gemara it means one thing, and in the Shulchan Aruch, when they use that expression, it means a totally different thing. In the context of the Gemara says, Bezin should not supervise a chalitza unless they ascertained in advance that the one who's performing the chalitza was the brother of the one who died. Chalitza is if a couple is married and the husband dies and he has no children. From any marriage, he had no children, even had a marriage, whatever, Jewish children. So then the wife needs chalitza. So let's say we didn't have the ability to ascertain, but the brother has to have to share the same father. Sometimes he's a half brother. If he's a half brother only for the mother, he doesn't have the same father, then the din of chalitza doesn't apply. If there's another brother who's a brother from the father, and I'm only a brother from the mother, I can't perform the chalitza. It has to be achim min ha'av has to do it. So the Gemara says that the bezdin should not perform the chalitza. And later on, when the woman will want to remarry, the chalutza will want to remarry, so she'll have to prove that the man who did the chalitza was indeed her husband's brother, mitzad ha'av. So the Gemara says bezin shouldn't do that because a later bezin may not be medayik. They'll assume that the earlier bezin did everything properly. So in the context of the Gemara, it's a psychological statement. A later bezin will not question what the earlier bezin did. They'll assume that everything was checked into. They won't be medayik. They won't realize that the earlier Bez never checked into it to make sure that the brother Minha'av. You had a case a few years ago. Happens to be a distant relative of mine. So there was a girl who finished college and she married a boy who barely finished high school. He had a Shachter cup. And she was so far advanced ahead of him intellectually. So after a few months of marriage, he unfortunately committed suicide. He felt so uncomfortable in the marriage, he committed suicide. They lived in Zurich. So they were so embarrassed that she needed chalitza. They weren't married long enough to have any children. So they needed chalitza, so they're embarrassed to do the chalitza there. So they decided to go to London to do the chalitza there. But the din is you have to have at least an Eid Echad come and testify that we know that this is the brother from the father who's doing the chalitza. So they had the Yavam and the Yavama with a third person from Zurich had to go to London to testify. That's the Gemara says, when the Bezdin writes, we ascertain, and the Shtar Chalitza, they write, we ascertain that the one who did the Chalitza was the brother from the father. So the Gemara says, that ascertaining is sufficient if you have an Eid Echad, it can even be a Korav, but you have to have an Eid Echad. So they had, because they were embarrassed to do the Chalitza in Zurich because of the whole background of the sad case. So they went to London, so they needed an Eid Echad. So in the context of the Gemara, that statement, Beidina Basa, Beidina Loidaki, is a psychological statement. A later Bezdin will not investigate whether the earlier Bezdin, he won't check into it, if the earlier Bezdin followed all the procedures or not. But in Shulchan Aruch, it means a different thing. Let's say there was a Din Torah and they went to the K'tzais HaChoshen and he followed his opinion. His Bezdin followed the K'tzais, so they pasken one way. Then if they would go to the Nesivos, who was a contemporary of the K'tzais, lived in a different city, he would have given a different psak, but he didn't prove that the K'tzais' psak was incorrect. He disagrees with the K'tzais' position. So you can't have a later psak. When Bezdin gives a psak, the case is closed, unless you can ascertain that the earlier Bezdin made a mistake. If they made a mistake, then the psak is off. A psak in error is not a valid psak. So then the later Bezdin can pass it, but you can't ascertain that it's wrong. The K'tzais and the Nesivos, each one is entitled to their opinion. So if the earlier Bezdin passed in one way, so then the Beis Yosef quotes the Chuvas HaRosh, Beidina Basa Beidina Laidaki, a different, not a psychological statement. A later Bezdin has no right to issue a psak on a case that an earlier Bezdin gave a psak on. Well, you haven't ascertained that there was a mistake in the original psak. They were entitled to their opinion. So that's why the psak of Mishora is binding, because the psak of Lefnim Mishora did. So in Shulchan Aruch, they quote from the Tur that the Yisur of Hatoyas Mishpat, Lasat Mishpat, that Yon Chabriba, you're not allowed to give a false psak, doesn't only apply to a psak of din, it applies to a pshara as well, because pshara is a din Torah. It's a psak, it's a din Torah of Yosher, of Lefnim Mishora Sadin, as opposed to a psak of din. There's a famous comment that they attribute to Rabbi Yona and Eibeshitz, that if there was a din Torah only on, I heard just the last two sentences from Weiss's talk before from the Shia. So if there would be a din Torah over $5, and I would lose the din Torah, I would never forgive the rabbi. I'll be angry at him, the Olam Void, because he paskin against me. But if the butcher has, years ago, the butcher would buy behem that would Shachter, so if the behem would turn out to be in the velu or treifa, he would suffer a major loss. They didn't have like today, whatever doesn't work out well, so you sell it as non-kosher. You have the shutfus kosher and non-kosher. So if the Rav will paskin that the behem is in the velu or treifa, it's a $5,000 loss, let's say. The butcher will not be angry at the rabbi. How come over here, because of $5, he's angry at the rabbi? Why he paskin against him? The other case is not angry. So the same name, Rabbi Yona and Eibeshitz, that I'm not so angry over the fact that I lost the $5. I'm angry why my opponent won the money. That's why. But if the Rabbi Paskin that is the Vela Treifa, no one else won. So if that's the din, that's a din. I won't be upset. So Leichik used to say that he has, that's a psychological explanation that they attribute to Rabbi Yona and Eibeshitz. But he said there's a halachic explanation for it as well. He said when a chacham gives a psak on a behemoth that it's a treifa, it's not a psak on this behemoth. The chacham gives it. Let's say there's a shayla in Hilchas Nida. Amara is an amara tomei, amara toher. The psak is not on this marriage. Psak is such a marriage should come up. What's the din in abstract? Such an animal should exist. What's the din? Will it be a treif or will it be an available? And the mela, this behemoth corresponds to that abstract din. So since the psak is an abstract, the psak was not on me. The rabbi didn't paskin on my behemoth, he just paskin an abstract, but it didn't tell it. Whenever you have a bezin paskins on the case. That's why we say bedina basa bedina loydaki. Once an earlier bezin paskin on the case, and you can dismiss the earlier psak by saying that it's a toiv. They weren't toiv by Mishnah. It says in Shulchan Aruch, whenever the bezin made a pshara and it's toiv by Mishnah, you reverse it. How often can you have a pshara? There was a toiv by Mishnah. Now it's a very unfortunate. It's a very common practice by the professional dayanim that they'll reverse a psak of an earlier bezin that was a pshara, and they'll say it was a toiv by Mishnah. Toiv by Mishnah on a pshara. That's pretty difficult. It's a joke. How can it be a toiv by Mishnah? Very rare. You're saying what you think subjectively. You think that Yosha dictates this direction. How can it be that it's a toiv by Mishnah? Now it's very common. The later bezdin, they have a crooked batidinam, unfortunately. So the later bezdin will dictate. The early bezdin was a toiv by Mishnah. The pshara is not fine, and therefore they'll give an upsa. The pasuk tells us, "V'yamdu shnei ha'anashim asher lahem hariv lifnei Hashem." So Gemara understands it. Myself, Shabbos Yamdu lifnei Hashem means lifnei hadayanim. The dayanim have to be yeshiva, and the baladinim and the edim have to be ba'midah. What does maybe Yamdu shnei ha'anashim asher lahem hariv? The two parties. That's what it sounds like. The two parties of Tavel and Nitva. Sometimes you have more than two people. There used to be a businessman in Washington Heights. He went to college. His father was a Satmar Dayan. The father let him go to college. He was very successful in business. So he tells me he remembers there used to be a shul in Washington Heights where they had a chazan. Orthodox shul, everybody was Orthodox. And somehow the chazan was traveling in Europe, and he went by plane from one city to the other. And someone took a photograph on Friday night when he was walking off of the plane. They took a photograph, and it has the date and the time on the photograph. The plane landed for some reason or another on Friday night. So the chazan got off the plane. And they printed this photograph in the Swiss newspaper. They have some Swiss newspaper that has the first page is in green. Got the name of the newspaper. So the Balabatim in Washington Heights heard about this. Scandalous. Their chazan was flying on a plane on Shabbos, and they wanted to fire it. So 100 Balabatim came with the dayan, with the chazan, to this Satmar dayan. Now, why they had to go to Satmar? The Rabbanim here in Washington Heights, enough Rabbanim. They went to the Satmar dayan. So the son of the dayan tells me, he left his father, he was single, he left his father's home. By the time he lived in Washington Heights, he was married then, but at that time he was single. He says he left his father's home to go to college that night. There were 101 people there, 100 Balabatim and one chazan. And then by the time he came back, 3 hours later, they were still there. They were all night long, they were there with a whole dinner. So that's what the Chazal were wondering. It's always one Taveh, one Nitva. Sometimes the Taveh are 100 people, and the Nitva is one person. Sometimes the Taveh is one person, and the Nitva is 100 people. How can it be Shnei HaNoshim? So the Chazal understood, the Shnei HaNoshim goes on the two Eidim. Kama, Asher Lahem Hariv, you read it as if it were written, Asher Lahem Hariv. Both the Eidim, when they give the Haggadah says, and the Baladinim, when they present their case, have to be Bamidah. So Tosfos writes in Masechet Zvachim that even though the Mishnah says if the Kohen does the Hakrabas HaKarbanos in a sitting position, so the Karbanos Apostle, Karbanos have to be done by Amida. There's a din, no one's allowed to sit in the Azar, but for the evidence sit in Azar, the world doesn't come to an end. So he did wrong. It's a question whether that's a din the Reiss or din the Rabban, and the ain't Shiva Azar. But a Kohen who does the Hakrabas HaKarbanos in the sitting position, the Karbanos Apostle, you have to do it over again. So Tosfos on that Mishnah in Zvachim comments, what about a din Torah? So Tosfos says, today, the days of the Bala Tosfos, today the practice is that the Rabbanim are moichel on their cover. So usually what happens in the Torah is not everybody comes at the same time. One person comes and he sits down. The next person comes and he sits down. Then when everybody's there, everybody's sitting down, then they start the din Torah. So the Hershel and Reiss said, that's not really right. We have to tell the Baladinim, please stand up. And then after, out of respect for the Yona, after they stand up, then we say, we give you permission to sit down. But it's not really right that you just let them sit down from the beginning to the end. Common practice is that they don't do that, but more correct is that that should be insisted upon. I commend the Beth of America that they don't permit Toanim. In America, the institution of Toanim is absolutely scandalous. Toanim changed the whole version of the story, and they don't let the Baldin present his case. Part of the judgment of the business, you have to look at the facial expressions of the person when he presents his case. I remember there was once a din Torah also, yeshiva with a Rebbe, and the yeshiva had a din Torah. So one of the parties asked me to be present just to watch. So I see the way the Rebbe just sits there with his hands folded like this. He doesn't bat an eyelash, he doesn't say a word. And his time presents the whole case. The time wasn't there, he doesn't know what's true, he doesn't know what's a lie. The person has to present the story himself. And if he's telling a lie, well, sometimes they come to Shachter, sometimes they come to Reiss, sometimes they come to Shachter. That's part of the Rishu Hakira of the business. You have to listen to the person, present his story by himself. He can't rely on the time to present. It's in other countries, I understand it's not like in New York, but in New York area, the institution of Toanim is a scandalous thing. The whole institution of Zabla in America is very problematic. They quote the name of Moshe Feinstein that Zabur Le'echad didn't work out in the days of the Gemara. The Chachamim recommended that's the best thing. If I pick one burger and the other party picks one burger, the two burger and pick the third dayan. So since each one of us was involved in establishing the business, so we'll both agree to follow the psak. So it'll be a better psak and be more acceptable. And in America, it turns out that it's not the case, that the one that I pick is always going to favor me. The one the other one picked is always going to favor him. That's not right. Just because I was picked by this Baldin doesn't mean I'm not supposed to act like a lawyer. I'm supposed to pass whatever the din really is and honesty. Most of the time, it turns out, 99% of the time, the borough who is picked by Reuven is going to say like Reuven. The borough is picked by Shimon is going to say like Shimon. It's not supposed to be like that. He's supposed to work harder to consider all possibilities, all angles. We're not supposed to falsify what the din is. So unfortunately, that's not the case. So we wouldn't recommend Zabur Le'echad in America. I remember many years ago, Rabbi David Cohen from Willig from Flatbush came to visit me in the summertime in the bungalow colony. We used to go to the bungalow colony. And he asked, would I agree to serve on a panel of Rabbanim to be available for Dinei Torah? He wanted to have a group of 25 Rabbanim who would avail themselves for Dinei Torah and allow the Balei Dinim to pick any of these. One have Zabur Le'echad, pick one of these 25 people. So after he got the 25 people to agree, so then no one wanted to go to that. Each one wanted to pick his own verse. So the whole plan fell through. I understand also the Aguda also tried to do that. It also fell through. Because people want to pick the borough is going to say what they want them to say. It's also scandalous that there is a din of sheikhad. The din of sheikhad applies, even if it's a case of Zabur Le'echad. What you have sometimes is, I pick my borough and I pay him as much as I want. The other one picks his borough, he pays him whatever he wants. So if someone pays an excessive amount, and then the third dayan, the both Baladin will pay. That's not the way it's supposed to be. Not that the Baldin is supposed to pay directly his borough. He's supposed to make out the check to the Bezdin, and the Bezdin will give the money to each one of the Rabban. Not supposed to give the money directly. And one Baldin is going to give 10 times as much as the other Baldin is giving. So that's considered sheikhad, outright sheikhad. And the din of sheikhad applies even if it's a case of Zabla. I remember I was once on a din Torah. And I was a borough for one side, and then there was a borough for the other side. He was being paid a fortune of money by his Balvin, and they were driving each other around. They didn't know each other before, but they became the best of friends because he kept on feeding him more money, kept on presenting more details in the case of everything. That's a passing in the Chumash that you're not allowed to. That's you're not permitted to listen to one Balvin. The other Balvin, he's going to tell you all kinds of stories. That's scandalous. I told the other fellow that he took Shochat, and the whole Bezdin was puzzled. So it came before Rosh Hashanah. He said, he sees me. He says, I have to ask him Mechila. That I said, I said, I don't have to ask him Mechila. You took Shochat. You're puzzled to be a Dayan. And he's a very rich man now because people like him as a Dayan because he takes the Shochat and he passes always in favor of that Balvin. That's not a dinner. That's scandalous. I commend the Bezdin of America that they don't allow Torah on him and they give an honest sock and they should continue for many years. The Paskin, someone saw me just yesterday. They said they saw that there's going to be a conference about Batadinim. What is it to discuss about Batadinim? All you have about divorce cases, no? About deciding money in divorce. I said, no, in business. You have a case, honest people, each one thinks that he's right. So you have to go to a dinner, peaceful. You go to a dinner and then the Bezdin has to pass and who's right. You should continue for many years for much hatzlach. Thank you.
We're going to take a 15-minute break and then reconvene at 11:30.
Hi, you want to get started? Good morning again. Welcome, everyone. My name is Benjamin Kamenetsky. I'm president of the Bezdin of America. It's a great privilege to have you all here today, and thank you all for coming. Before I introduce our panel, I wanted to first thank the Menahel of our Bezdin, Rav Shlomo Weissman, and our Scott Menahel, Rav Michael Zuckerman, who put together today's program. It's a wonderful turnout and a wonderful program, and we very much appreciate their work on the program. And in general, the reputation, for excellence, sensitivity, caring, hard work of the Bezdin of America is built on the foundation of Rabbis Weissman and Rabbi Zolman, and we have tremendous hakaras hatov for them. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce the wonderful panel that we have today. First and foremost, Noy Rabbi, Rav Willig, who was elected this past Kislev as Av Bezdin after the first yahrzeit of our previous long-serving Av Bezdin, Rav Gedalia Dov Schwartz, Zecher Tzaddik L'Bracha. Rabbi Willig doesn't need an introduction in this neighborhood. Rosh Yeshiva of YU, Rosh Kol YU, Rabbi of Young Israel of Riverdale. I feel like I need to say this, Rebbe. My first exposure to a Bezdin or to a Din Torah was in 1987 when I was an early admissions freshman in Rabbi Willig's shir. It was a wonderful shir. We learned Subas that year. And a machloket, broke out between two students in the shir. This is actually a true story. One had a side gig as a yeshivish bookbinder, where the kind with the drilling holes and the electric tape and the nylon thread. And another talmid, used the person's bookbinding service. And the bookbinder said, that will be $8, please. And the other student said, no, it's $6 is the going rate for bookbinding. And the bookbinder said, yes, but that's for normal Gemara. Yours has the deluxe edition with the extra Rishonim in back, so it's $8. And so they couldn't settle this dispute. So they went to Rav Willig, and Rav Willig convened a Bezdin. I'm not joking. The Bezdin was Rav Willig, of Hershel Shachter and of Yaakov Newberger. And we did it in the front of the classroom. And the two sides presented their cases, passionately arguing why it's $8 or $6 for the bookbinding service. And it doesn't take, well, anyway, one could imagine that when the bid and ask is $6 and $8, there might be a pshara possible. So Rav Shachter, after the two sides said, maybe a pshara, and the bookbinder said, no pshara, only did. And what's hilarious is like for the next 30 years, when Rav Willig sees anyone from the shir, it's the first thing, Shalom Aleichem, no pshara. Anyway, so that was yeah. Our second.
What was the decision?
I don't remember. Every penny, right?
I'm still in touch with
It was certainly Ba'ava, they accepted it, but also pleasure to introduce the Skan of Basin, Rav Yona Reiss. Rav Yona Reiss is the Basin of the Rabbinical Council of Chicago. He's also Rosh Yeshiva at YU. He was the former dean of Reiss. Reiss also is a Yale Law School graduate, and he spent 6 years at Cleary Gottlieb. And Achron, the moderator, is my dear beloved friend, Michael Avi Helfand. Still trying to figure out his real first name. Avi is a graduate of YU. He has a JD from Yale Law School, a PhD from Yale in political science. He's currently the Vice Dean of Pepperdine Law School, as well as chair in law and religion. He's literally perhaps the foremost expert in issues of law and religion. He's quoted everywhere. He published more than one could imagine, and everywhere from the Yale Law Journal, NYU Law Journal, Law Review, to the Wall Street Journal, Mishpacha Magazine, which is, of course, the pinnacle of legal publications. But more importantly, or his biggest accomplishment is he survived working for me at Davis Polk for a year, where he was a brilliant first-year associate, and I tried every way possible to haze him during that fun time that we had together, and he survived. So the Coven Gadol, I turn this over to Professor Helfand.
We're just going to sit together and chat, right? Before I get started, I do want to say the following. I don't think anybody's mentioned them yet, but I also have the pleasure of serving on the board of the Basin of America, along with Benjamin Kamenetsky. And I think it's important just to note, there are a couple others here, what an extraordinary pleasure and honor it is to serve on that board, particularly the executive board, along with Benjamin Kamenetsky, Henry Orlinsky, and if he's out there in the virtual world, Alicia Graff. These people are some of the finest people I know, and it's no coincidence that the Basin of America attracts some of the finest people. And I'd be remiss if I just didn't say how much I've learned being on that board with them, how much kindness, wisdom, honesty, justice, commitment to the very best principles that halacha and hashkafa have. And I just want to thank them for that opportunity. It's wonderful to be able to do that with them. Okay, we're supposed to talk a little bit about today, the Basin system, where we are and where we're headed. Maybe I'll start with what we would call the softball, and start with maybe if Rabbi Willig and Rabbi Reiss, each of you might comment a bit on, well, where are we?
I first want to thank both Benjamin and Avi, because where we are is a result, in part, of their heroic efforts. I'll tell you the following story. It's a true story. Beth was convened concerning, as the Shachter kept talking about, it keeps coming up, the termination of a Rebbe from a yeshiva. case came before the Bezdin of America. The Bezdin of America found in favor of the Rebbe and ruled that it had to be reinstated. For those who are familiar with the Bezdin system, that is a rarity. Usually it's a question of how much severance and this and that. We actually said he has to be reinstated to his tenured position. Fine. So the Rebbe was told that if you don't go to the secular court within 12 months, it can be vacated, and then you have to start all over again from the secular perspective. So you got some kind of two-bit attorney, present company excluded completely. And he tried to get it put in a simple enough system, but his lawyer was not A1. And the school had this crackerjack attorney. So guess what? It was they told me it was a self-hating Jew who actually ruled against what was the Bezdin? But you can't do that. With arbitration, there's only two ways out of arbitration. Either it's illegal, it's unethical, dishonest, they took bribe, or there was ex parte, or it's irrational. This judge, Paskin, it was irrational. Let me tell you, at that moment in time, where are we? The entire Bezdin system in the United States of America shook. Because there were three judges, they gave it a ruling, it was a proper ruling, and some judge decides it's irrational, so that every single case of a Bezdin anywhere in the whole country is subject to review by any judge who'll just say it's irrational. We were in trouble. But Reiss was the banal at the time, am I correct?
When the case was heard, but not when the decision was issued.
Correct, but he gets the credit. Now, the Reiss was the banal when the case was heard. He said, what do we do? So we got to get crackerjack attorneys who work for us pro bono, and they'll have this reversed. Two attorneys stepped forward, Rabbi Yona Kamenetsky and Rabbi Helfand. That must have been that 1 year we were together in the law firm. Hashem put you that 1 year together, that 1 year when we needed you the most. And they hit what we call in our language a grand slam. They represented this Rebbe. We went to a court, a higher appellate division, 5 judges, and they won 5-0. At that point in time, the Bezdin system in America was strengthened more than ever before. So before I answer your question, Abby, where are we? I want to thank you and Binyamin for helping us to be where we are. You also have to thank Binyamin. He doesn't want the applause, but he deserves it, that's for sure. For accepting upon himself the presidency. You know, we heard from Rabbi Weiss that an Av Bezdin has to know how to take heat in the kitchen. Let me tell you, a president could also have heat. Before I asked Rabbi Yona to accept this position, which is a position of great responsibility, and I have great trust in him. Yes, we go back to that year, 1986, 87, when he was in my shir, and we spent many subsequent years in his camp and yeshiva together. Now his Baruch Hashem, his children are stars in our yeshiva, thank God. But before I asked him to do it, I said, I want to come to your house. We'll talk on the phone. I want to come to your house. Came to his house, and I said, Yaman, I know that you're a talented attorney. You also have a history. Your father, Shalita, who served in a capacity as a Rav, with plenty of heat too. Your father-in-law, someone who, I knew quite well, was a public person who helped in many ways, Tzorchet Tzibur, OU, and other things. Would you be willing to take this on? For the Bibis Yonis. Why did I come to your house? You told us on the phone. I have to get permission from your wife, from Esty, who I know, Esty Weber, as a little kid in Morasha. And without her permission and her knowledge that it can cause Bizyonis, you can't accept it. She said yes. And that's another reason why we are where we are. Because both Binyamin and his wife Esty said yes to accept this position. One more story. And that is, right in front of me sits Shlomo Weissman, who was our Manahal. who succeeded Rabbi Reiss, who was Manal before him. When I also a Talmud from way back, and when I asked him to take the position, I went to his house and spoke to his wife, whom I did not know. And I was a little worried. Esther, I knew. Mrs. Weiss, I did not know before. I said, I'm asking your husband to take the position. I said, because Yona, who knows what's going to happen? They're going to come pick in front of your house. Who knows what they're going to do? And she also said yes. And that's why we are what we are. So before I answer the question in terms of the how should we say it, the legalistic system, no system is better than the persons who are involved in the system. And I'm so grateful to those who I mentioned and those who have not yet mentioned for making the system what it is. I hope to get to those other persons in the course of my remarks. Where Bezin is, how do you define Bezin? I'm limiting my remarks to Bezin in the United States of America. Eretz Yisrael is a completely different system. It's a government-sponsored system. The other systems in Europe and elsewhere, that's too far afield. When we say we cannot limit ourselves to the Bezin of America. That would be too narrow a focus. Because as we know, if our Bezin summons someone to a Din Torah, they can opt for a different Bezin. We are not presumptuous enough to consider ourselves a Bezin Kavua for the entire United States of America. Some may like if we did that, but we're not going to do that. And therefore, if we're not a Bezin Kavua for the whole country, as it says in Shulchan Aruch, a person can say, I want a different Bezin. And so we have to willy-nilly deal with other Batei Dinim. So we say where we are, it's not just our Bezin, it's other Batei Dinim as well. And other Batei Dinim come in all different types and stripes. Rav Shachter, Shlita, had some less than complimentary words about some of them. Rav Shachter's my Rebbe, but I argue with him. But they're different, there are differences in nuance, the difference in the level of competence, professionalism, honesty. And we have to deal with this entire system. The system, where we are, what do they say? The best of times, the worst of times. I believe that from an organizational perspective, there are more competent professional about it now than there were when I first became involved in the Bezin of America. Frankly, that's one of the reasons I did become involved, because I thought it was a Malcolm Shein Anoshim to talk about 25 years ago, when I first was asked to be the associate to Rabbi Gedaliah Dov Schwartz. And I did it because I came off a couple of hard experiences. Either lack of honesty, shoichat, very famous personalities whose names I will not mention, or simply a different approach. A different approach from a different sector of the Orthodox community. And I felt strongly that while these individuals who are honest are the appropriate judges for that sector, they're not the appropriate judges for what we'll call, for the lack of a better term, our community. In a particular case, there was a wonderful dayan from Borough Park, Hasidic Rav, honest as the day is long. Another Rav from Monsey, New York, very, very honest. They had a different worldview than I did. And I don't just mean a worldview about the state of Israel or something like that. I mean a worldview about halacha in Choshen Mishpat. Whereas I was much more willing to take into account secular law as a minig hamedina, knowing how people deal. They said to me, secular law. So why should we go to the yeshiva and then the Choshen Mishpat? We should just go to law school. So I was outvoted by two honest people. It was a pshara, but I learned that there's room for a bezin that will have an attitude more in line and in sync with the mindset of people from our community. And remember, we're not discussing Shor Shanoga Chesapor. We're discussing it was a meeting of the mind of two people. A contract was signed. What do they have in mind? That's what the psak has to be based upon. So knowing the Simon Shulchan Aruch is very nice, but you have to know how to apply it in a particular case. So I've spoken too long. I'll hand it over to Rabbi Reiss, but that's where we are.
Shus, Maria Rabbi, Willig Shlita. I think we're in a pretty good place with Rabbi Willig as our Bezdin. So I'll start there. And I'll echo Rabbi Willig's sentiments regarding the tremendous leadership of the lay leadership of the Bezdin and the rabbinic leadership of the Bezdin. It's really top notch. One of the great perks of working at the Bezdin, where I served as a Menayel for 10 years under Rav Gedalia Dov Schwartz, Zechat Tzaddik Levacha, Yibadol Chaim Tovim, Rav Willig Shlita, was the fact that it was not only a place committed to tzedek u'mishpat, committed to justice and righteousness and professionalism and fairness in the optimal sense, but it was also a truly wonderful working environment, which is a very unusual thing for a Jewish communal organization. It's a place where everybody respected each other and got along fabulously. The Rabbanim, the lay leadership, the staff members in the office, the interns, every single person who was ever hired by the Bezdin. It was just a wonderful working atmosphere. I have to tell you that that's something which speaks worlds about the Bezdin of America, if you want to just have an appreciation for the type of organization that it is. In terms of what I have seen over the years of how far we've been able to progress and where we still can move in the future, when I started at the Bezdin around the same time that Rabbi Willig did, I was drafted only very shortly afterwards, I believe. People really weren't using Bezdin that much. Maybe they would come to Bezdin for a get. We haven't spoken about the divorce cases getting so much. It's obviously a very important part of what the Bezdin does. But in terms of the Dinei Torah, in terms of Choshen Mishpah types of disputes, there were really only two types of cases that people would bring in front of the Bezdin. One was a Hasagas Gvul case, where one pizza store opens up across the street from another pizza store, and the first owner brings a claim for unfair business competition, because even if they would bring all of their other lawsuits in secular court, they knew they couldn't bring this one in secular court because they'd be laughed out of the courtroom because there's free competition in the secular world. And the other type of case was kind of like money under the table, shall we say, type of cases, where if they would bring them to the secular court, both parties would get locked up. So those were the cases that people brought, but otherwise they didn't feel necessarily that the Bezdin was in touch with the contemporary commercial marketplace. And what the Bezdin of America did at the time was to bring in people who had a legal background, people with a business background, to have appropriate experts on different panels depending on what the case was about. We had a securities fraud case, so we brought in somebody who was a big securities expert to be one of the panelists, so that the business people and their attorneys can have a comfort level that the Bezdin was in touch, not only of having the Choshen Mishpah trading, but as Rabbi Willig Shlita said, that they would also have an appreciation for the Minhag HaSochrim, for the customs of the marketplace and the relevant secular law that might be applicable to the dispute or the transaction in question. I knew that the Bezdin had finally made its way on the map when I got a call once from a producer of a TV show called Law and Order. And they wanted to do an episode in which they would feature a Bezdin in the episode. I don't remember what the facts were about, something about proving somebody's Jewishness, and it would have an effect on some custody dispute, something like that. And they wanted to call the Bezdin of New York. And they felt that we were the Bezdin of America located in New York, and maybe it was a little bit too close for comfort from the perspective of their legal team. So they wanted my permission as the director of the Bezdin to allow them to use the moniker Bezdin of New York without getting themselves into legal trouble. And I said, I have no problem with that whatsoever. That's great. I only have one condition. So I said, okay, what's the one condition? I said that I get to write the episode. that was the end of the conversation, loss of my potential Hollywood career. But I understand that they did actually feature a Besdin in a subsequently filmed episode. I think they called it the House of Israel. They figured that was safe enough. But what it showed is that Besdin was on the map. And if you would have looked at a Jewish newspaper 25 years ago, you would have seen articles about the shuls and yeshivas and mikvahs and Erevin, but you wouldn't have seen anything about Besdin because it wasn't on people's radar, even though this institution is just as important as all of the other institutions that I mentioned for a viable Jewish community. And what has happened in the past quarter century is that now Besdin is something that you will read about in the newspapers. It is something that's on people's lips. Maybe it's on people's lips that they're condemning all the what they did for being terrible and not being good enough, but people are talking about it. They recognize that Besdin is a vital part of the community. It's a vital part of our lives, a vital part of what can make us all better as a community. So therefore, I think we've come a very long way in this past quarter century. What we've seen in the last several years is a desire of those Batei Din that really do want to do the right thing to work together cooperatively to develop more streamlined standards so that it won't be more like the Wild West as it has been to a certain degree over the years. So in the last number of years, we actually have been successful, and I give Rabbi Zilberman an enormous amount of credit for convening these types of gatherings. We've been able to bring together Rabbanim from all over the country, for example, who are involved in Gittin. So we have conferences of Mesadre Gittin where we discuss common issues that we're all facing and common problems and common shilohs so that we can have common standards and we can work together in a way in which we further the purposes of halacha, the purposes of serving our community. We've done the same thing in the past 15, 17 years or so with respect to the creation of a network of conversion courts, of Batei Din for Giur. The Besdin of America always stayed away. This was apparently based on some mandate that was received from Rav Soloveitchik, the Rabbi Schwartz, as Zatzal used to quote, that the Rav said the Besdin of America shouldn't perform conversions because there's so much scandal and there's so much pressure and there's so much corruption in the world of conversions, better not to be involved in conversions. But we saw that didn't cause the scandal and the corruption to go away. It still needed to be addressed. So at a certain point, the Besdin of America, rather than taking upon itself to perform conversions directly, took upon itself, together with the Rabbinical Council of America, to oversee a system, a network of recognized conversion courts that would all have uniform, streamlined standards throughout North America. And now that entire system, which is overseen by the Besdin of America, is the Shemelus Seferis. It has caused a tremendous sanctification of God's name, and it has enabled the converts to go through a proper conversion process and also to have their conversions automatically recognized all over the world. I think that's a great accomplishment. The Besdin of America has been in the forefront of that. And one of the things that we're working on right now is to have a similar consortium of Batei Din that really want to operate with professionalism and integrity, and we know who they are. To get together to articulate kosher mishpat standards. What are the proper standards that should be followed in kosher mishpat cases? What is the proper way to go about convening a zabla? For a period of time, if the two parties couldn't agree on a particular Besdin, rather than sending the case to the zabla wolves, where each party would choose a gangster to represent them, and then the two gangsters would choose a rabbi who's willing to sit with gangsters, we tried to put together a system where if one party said, Ruben said, I want to go to Besdin of America, and Shimon said, I want to go to, let's say, Besdin of Machol LaHaira, we would work together. The Besdin of America would appoint one dayan, Machol LaHaira would appoint one dayan, and then those two dayanim would appoint a dayan from another Besdin, where each Besdin, the dayan would be working under the auspices of an institutionalized Besdin and would act with the proper standards of integrity that are incumbent upon a dayan who sits in any case. I remember once sitting with the Debetziner Rav in Brooklyn to talk about how maybe their Besdin, the Carlsberg Besdin, could join in this effort. If one party said, I want to go, you have a divorce case in Teaneck, God forbid. And the wife said, I want to go to Beis Din America. And the husband said, well, the natural Beis Din for me, because I live in Teaneck, is the Beis Din of Carlsberg in Borough Park. So I spoke to the Deborah Rob. So in that case, maybe the Carlsberg Beis Din could appoint one Dayan, and we'll appoint one Dayan, and those two Dayan will appoint a third Dayan, rather than throwing the case to a Zabla, which he also admitted would be a terrible travesty, because the Zablas do not operate properly nowadays, as Shachter pointed out. So he said, the problem that I have with that is that you're Dayanim, as far as I know, you all went to college, and therefore, according to my father, the Be'er Moshe, they're all disqualified from being Dayanim. So I said, don't worry, we forgot everything that we studied. But we can continue that conversation today and really work together with the Batei Din, and to have a better system, as Rabbi Willig said, that doesn't only involve the Beis Din of America, but also involves working with the other Batei Din. I think that the future is bright with the team that we have in place, with some of our partners that we have in place, and especially with Rabbi Willig at our help.
There are a whole bunch of themes I want to follow up on, particularly Rabbi Reiss, your foray into the Los Angeles world of film. That's really great. Come back with me to LA, and we'll. I know some people. Okay, in all seriousness. But before, I really want to follow up on some of the get issues, which Rabbi Reiss noted we haven't talked a ton about, and also on the increased use of Beis Din. I think that's a really interesting phenomenon that I'd like us to chat about a little bit more. But before we do any of that, first of all, Mazel tov to both of you on your new appointments, Av Beis and Av Beis Din. Obviously, this comes on the heels of an extraordinary loss within the Beis Din world over Gedalia Dov Schwartz that's out last year. And both of you noted the way in which the Beis Din of America tried to find its own niche and craft a certain kind of Beis Din. I wonder if you could both comment a little bit on Gedalia Dov Schwartz's role in that process and his legacy generally for the Beis Din world and maybe even beyond.
It's very difficult to talk about such a great personality as Rabbi Gedalia Schwartz, who was really special, really almost unique. He combined service as a Dayan at the highest level, with the knowledge, with the insight, we'll call it pichus. He was very clever, he was sensitive, he was a great spokesperson, having served as a community rabbi, significant synagogues. He was devoted. He'd go the extra mile. The Hasil Oshet Mer Oshko. The Beis Din is supposed to help those individuals who need help, both who need help in the monetary field, and as well those who need help in personal status issues, which can relate to divorce and other things as well. We don't have anyone like that. I accepted the position. First, as you said, I insisted on waiting a year to honor his memory. I also insisted that we have a team. I know my own limitations. And therefore, the elevation of Reiss Shalita to the associate, as well as the already existing team of Rabbi Weissman and Rabbi Zilberman as Menal and Sgan Menal, respectively, two outstanding professionals, Talmidei Chachamim. Should also mention that we have a new Chaver Beis Din, Rabbi Itamar Rosenzweig, who was a superstar, also editor of Jewish Prudence. All attorneys here should please read what he has to say. He can take something written by someone such as myself and make it look much better, almost unrecognizable. We thank him, his professional staff. I really feel we have a debt of gratitude. We heard about the ambience of the Beis Din. Thank God we have a new individual. We always insist on having a woman on the staff because there's so many divorce cases. The woman shouldn't feel she's coming to a den of men. There has to be a woman there to make her feel more comfortable. A present associate is a rookie, But I want to speak about our veterans who have retired recently. Mrs. Helen Axelrod, Mrs. Chani Zatz. Those names may not mean anything to you, but that was the nuts and the bolts of the Bezdin for decades upon decades, with such sensitivity and professionalism, discretion. We owe them all where we are a great debt of gratitude. And we hope that it will continue with our present associate who's doing that work, but I won't comment that I don't really know her well. It's not fair. Hopefully, we'll have another meeting in a few years, and I'll be able to say the same thing about her. So Rabbi Schwartz left us to a better place. We have to continue. We have to continue with his legacy of honesty, professionalism, sensitivity, devotion to both the community and to the individuals to the best of our own limited ability.
For the sake of time, I'll just mention two things about Rabbi Schwartz. One is that Rabbi Schwartz would continuously tell me that 90% of being a good dayan is human relations. That it's learning to get along with people, and it's also learning to listen to people, and not to be judgmental about people when they don't act at their best during emotionally vulnerable times in their lives, when they might appear before the Bezdin for a din Torah or for a get, to always give people the benefit of the doubt in terms of your long-term assessment of the individual. Those were very important life lessons to learn from Rabbi Schwartz in terms of his demeanor, in terms of his respect for every single individual. I think that is a large component of what caused him to be such a wonderful dayan, so respected by everybody from all types and all stripes and all streams from all over. Second thing that I'll mention about Rabbi Schwartz is that one should not be fooled by that very kind and grandfatherly demeanor of Rabbi Schwartz to think that he could be manipulated in any way when it came to halakhic integrity. Rabbi Schwartz also stood very much for the principle of lo sagun pnei ish, that when it came to doing the right thing, he was fearful of absolutely nobody. Rabbi Schwartz, if he felt that he had to be machmir, he didn't care how many people were putting pressure upon him or how many people said, oh, but don't you care about the agunot? Nobody cared more than Rabbi Schwartz. If there was a heter, Rabbi Schwartz would find it. But if there was some illegitimate group that would suddenly sprout up and say, oh, we found a systemic solution to free all of the agunot without ever requiring a get, Rabbi Schwartz would be the first one to condemn such a group, such a Bezdin, despite what might have been the noblest of intentions. And when it came to the other side of the equation, if Rabbi Schwartz really felt that there were grounds to be lenient and there was tremendous pressure that maybe other Batei Din didn't want to be lenient and maybe he would be condemned or excoriated afterwards, he didn't care about that either. He only cared about doing the Ratzon Hashem, doing what was right and appropriate in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch.
Okay, so maybe we'll start with getting into what both of you, I think, addressed as a somewhat new phenomenon, something that wasn't around 25 years ago, the kind of use of Beis Din. And maybe we'll do two parts to this question. So first of all, what do you attribute that to? Why is it the case that you're seeing increased use of Batei Din? And then maybe on the flip side, what do you see as kind of, to the extent there is, where Hershel Weiss mentioned worries about Pshara. What are some of the reluctances, the concerns that you hear from people in our community, so to speak, as to why they're still worried about coming to Batei Din? So why the increased use, and also kind of what are still some of the worries?
Of course, Rabbi Hershel Weiss, very perceptive individual, aside from his mastery of the entire corpus of halacha, understand that if every Bezdin is going to give 50-50 pshara, then no one's going to come to Bezdin and say, I think they're 100% right. Of course, in our system, we have a system which is called pshara krova l'din. What does that mean? I was just asked. What it means is as follows, as Rabbi Shachter said. He didn't elaborate because he was running off to say a shir. He spoke very shorthand, and those of us who are his students and disciples understand between the lines. He says one word, he means another 100. What he meant was as follows: that the Pshara Krov of the Din is the proper prayer, as he brought it from our Rebbe Rav Soloveitchik. It's a combination of Din and the Fnim Yeshuas of Din. We'll call it law, and we'll call it equity, Yosher. But you have to first know the law, then be able to apply the equity. That's what's called Krov the Din. You know what the Din is, and then, now that we know what the Din is, we can then apply principles of equity. In a half a sentence, Rabbi Shachter said he had a case where he favored in front of one party, they got all the money, B'din and B'pshara. It's like the $8. That was the Din, that was the Pshara. That's it. The Pshara doesn't mean you're going to get something. And our Bezdin, very often, it's a slam dunk, even though it says Pshara Krov Din, because the person is right from this perspective of strict justice. It's also right from the perspective of equity. He gets everything. So it's very important that we establish it, as Rabbi Weiss said, very, very important. That's one reason for reluctance, that we try to obviate that. Number two is that, as we heard again from Rabbi Shachter, he said it more clearly than Rabbi Weiss, that there are certain Batei Din that are like we love all Jews, we really do. But, we have to say that, as much of the truth as is necessary, not more than that. They're based on what they call ex parte communication. As Rabbi Shachter Shlita said, it's against an explicit din. Yes, I'm aware there's an Aruch HaShulchan. There's always a rabbi you can find somewhere. And the Aruch HaShulchan said about what happened in Europe, unfortunately, which is still happening today, is that the Zabla, where each would pick one particular judge, they fell into the trap described by the Rush hundreds and hundreds of years ago. He called them the Yesh Toim, the mistaken ones, who view their role as a borer as an attorney, as a lawyer who's going to make the party win all the time. That's not that's not at all what it is. I heard a story about Rav Moshe Feinstein. Someone came to scream and yell, Rav Moshe is no good. What happened? I chose him as a borer, and he ruled against me. That's a go. He wasn't, but he expected the borer to be in his hip pocket like everybody else. So people can very well understand why this is. By the way, I think I have many lawyers in the room here. I believe that such a system, ex parte, is automatically subject to total cancellation by a secular court. Because ex parte is, as far as I know, I think in most states, is grounds for dismissal. So how do the Aruch HaShulchan allow it? Because you know what? Someone called it a gangster. That's the system. Reuben talks to his borough, Shimon talks to his borough. So what does it end up being? A bezin of one. We call the sholish, who was chosen by the two, and he has to wend his way between what some call two gangsters, and somebody have to know what his gangster affiliation might be as well, because if they picked him, maybe he swims with them somewhere. So really, it's a big problem. It really is. And because this law system is so broken, everybody Bezin gets a bad rap. People don't discriminate between a Zabla system and a sitting Bezin system. Truth to be told, from the perspective of our community, I think before our Bezin became reorganized, and there's one more person and institution that deserves credit. His name is Mr. Shelley Rudolph, who helped reorganize the Bezin together with a group called the Orthodox Caucus. Yes, also a blessed memory, we can say. We did some good things. And we started sending out hasmanos on a more regular basis. That's what changed the system, sending out summonses. Before that, they almost never sent out a summons. So if two people wanted to come, great. If not, there was nothing. And the other Batei Din, which already existed and still exists, and we'll call, for the lack of a better expression, the more called right-wing communities, people didn't view them as understanding them. And they really don't understand them. They're coming from a different universe, which is all fair in that universe. It's arguable that the Aruch HaShulchan system is not dishonest, it's just a recognition of what was going on, and he gave it his consent, because they all know the other one is not being fair, so he can also be unfair. We don't count with that system. We totally prohibit ex parte, completely. To my knowledge, I've been involved in 25 years, it's never happened. Our Bezin may not be the greatest Bekim in all of Choshen Mishpat. I'm willing to concede that there are others who know every sip better than we do. But I think that from the perspective of honesty and integrity, lack of ex parte, professionalism, these people who don't want to come, tell them to come to the Bezin of America.
I'll just mention, I think that there are probably 3 reasons why people are utilizing Bate Din much more today than they did 25 years ago. One is that we showed it through the Beis Din of America, and some other Bate Din followed suit as well, or maybe went in lockstep with us, how you really could do things better in a way that's more responsive to the community and more understanding of current contemporary business disputes. People used to be afraid that not only did the Beis Din not understand their type of transaction, but that the Beis Din didn't know how to issue a decision that would be enforceable altogether. So Rabbi Willig mentioned previously how every single case of the Beis Din of America has stood up whenever it's been challenged in court or whenever anybody needed to enforce the decision. I prided myself when I was the Menahel of having, I guess you call it like an earned run average of 0. If there wasn't a single runner that crossed the plate, there wasn't any case of the Beis Din that got overturned. The case Rabbi Willig spoke about was really my left on base case. And Rabbi Weissman, Baruch Hashem, was able to bail me out of my left on base runner. That even that case was held up on appeal, and Rabbi Weissman has continued this tradition as well. And it's because we do a very, very careful job of making sure that we not only are following the halakhic protocols, but we're following all of the protocols of arbitration law, so that the parties sign proper arbitration agreements. We have published rules and procedures. The parties know what they're getting themselves into. That's been copied by a number of Bate Din as well, so the parties just feel much more comfortable about the process. That's number one. Number two, there has been a growth in general in terms of the utilization of ADR, as alternative dispute resolution. People have gotten more and more fed up with the courts because the courts take a very long time and they're a very expensive process, and people are not necessarily happy with the decisions that they get in court at the end of the process. And the only people really making lots of money in the court cases are the lawyers. And we have lawyers here. The lawyers are not necessarily all out to make money, but they recognize that there are imperfections with the system. And therefore, even outside of the halakhic universe, there are more and more people who are looking to go to the American Arbitration Association, other forms of arbitration, because it's viewed as a less expensive and often more efficient process than going to the secular courts. And finally, there has been, Baruch Hashem, a gradual movement in the American Jewish community, particularly the American Orthodox Jewish community, to become more and more observant. And over time, people have discovered more halachos. Oh yeah, Taras Mishpacha, Tfilas Kelim, davening with a minion. People have discovered things over time, and the observance in general has grown. And therefore, when people became more aware of the fact that in addition to questions about Basar V'Cholav and how to observe Shabbos, there's a chedek of Shulchan Aruch called the Choshen Mishpat that you're supposed to observe as well, and that there's a prohibition of going to secular courts, and there's a mitzvah of establishing rabbinical courts and going to rabbinical courts. So people have wanted to fulfill that mitzvah more and more. There are more Choshen Mishpat kolim all over the country, and people really learning these halachos and taking them seriously. One of the challenges that we have is that people still worry a little bit about predictability. Not that everyone considers themselves an expert in Shulchan Aruch, that they feel that they have to walk in with an understanding of everything that the Dayanim are going to take into account. But if you go to court, so there are decisions, there are published decisions, so people can look and see, how have these types of cases been decided before? People have a real thirst in knowing how has the Bezdin of America decided cases in the past. Obviously, every single case is different, and you can't say for sure that one precedent is going to be binding upon a different panel, but I think that's something that people really look for. And one thing that the Bezdin of America has done, particularly under Rabbi Weissman's leadership, is to take cases where we publish decisions. One of the hallmarks of arbitration is that everything has to be confidential and anonymous, and to have gotten permission from the parties after anonymizing the parties' names and changing some of the facts of a decision and showing the redacted version to the original parties to get their permission, even then, to make sure to get their permission to publish decisions. And in a number of cases, they have granted that permission. And now if you go on the Bezdin of America website, you can see a wide plethora of different types of decisions that the Bezdin of America has issued, so people can have that comfort level that sometimes causes individuals to be reluctant. The other thing that the Bezdin has done is to publish this new site, Jewish Prudence, which sets forth, if not an actual decision, just a description of how the Bezdin deals with different types of cases in general. It's kind of like an article, and that also hopefully will provide a greater comfort level and will cause even those who still have some reservations to overcome those hesitations and to use the Bezdin even more.
Before I go to the next question, I need to mention a CLE word for the viewers out there. The CLE word is table, as in under the table. Or okay, table. Good, fantastic. Okay, great. So many things again to follow up on, but one of the things that's come up a little bit is the way in which panels are built and representatives are allowed to represent litigants before the base sit. And there's been a lot of talk of Toanim, and also a little bit of discussion of lawyers. When Rabbi Shachter was speaking, he mentioned how one of the challenges when you have a Toan is that you're not hearing directly from the party. But at the same time, if you have a lawyer, you might have the same kind of problem. So I wonder if you might both comment both on the Basin of America's policy, not having Toanim, at least as a general matter, but at the same time having lawyers, and kind of where you see the pros and cons, and why you're comfortable with some people serving as representatives, but not others.
Okay. There's no need for me to continue to belabor the Toanim problem. Both of the predecessors spoke about it. You have to see it to believe it. These guys come in, they start screaming and yelling and with all kinds of irrelevancies. And the more outrageous their behavior, the higher price they can command. There's simply no punishment, no accountability. You can't be disbarred from being a Toan. If someone would charge disbarred, you could fetch an even higher price. You see how dishonest I am. That's the reality. I'm not gonna say another word, enough said. The lawyers, there are many lawyers in the room. Lawyers, number one, present company excluded, but have been known to be disbarred. If they cross certain ethical lines, they just lose their license. There's a certain, that's called a fear factor. No one wants to lose the lawyer's license. And therefore, they can't conduct these kinds of shenanigans, which are blatantly dishonest. Can't. If they will, they're risking their license. And therefore, they don't. Number two, Toanim, by their very nature, think that they know better than the rabbis sitting on the Torah. Because after all, they're supposed to be experts in halacha, and they know every little wrinkle. As Rabbi Shachter said, we don't need you to tell us what the halacha is. The Bezdin knows what the Shulchan Aruch says too. You have a point to make here and there, it can be made. Any person who wants to have a Toan in our Bezdin, no problem. Just leave him at home. Let him write you a brief, let him do what you want. You cannot walk into the Bezdin. So if he has something to say which will enlighten us, let him write a brief and give it to you. But you can't walk into the room. You walk into the room, it's a whole different ambience completely. Attorneys sometimes wish to speak for their parties from the get-go. As a rule, we do not allow it. We insist that the presentation be made by the party, him or herself. Then the attorney wants to embellish a little bit, so we allow it. Number one, we have to allow it. If we won't allow it, what's another grounds for dismissal by the secular courts? The person not getting right to counsel. So we have to allow it. And frankly, in some cases, the lawyer can repeat something that the party said, him or herself, in a better way. But we were first able to, as a Shachter called, look the guy in the eye or the lady in the eye, and try to the best of our ability, ascertain from our perspective whether we think it's true or not. So the Tonim scream and yell, won't let their parties open their mouth. It's better they shouldn't come into the room at all. So that's why our party policy has been not to allow Tonim. We allow lawyers, and I'll say it this way it is. Lawyers come in different shapes as well. Some try to maybe a little bit too assertive, and we try to know how to nicely respond.
I also won't belabor the point. Just Weiss quoted two shuvos by the Mari Buna, so I'll quote a third. The Mari Buna, also, this is going many hundreds of years ago. The Mari Buna spoke about the scourge that existed already in his day, that it became commonplace to allow toanim. He spoke about a case where one side had a towing for the first half of the Din Torah, then the other side bought off that towing for the second half of the Din Torah, so the towing switched sides. And then they wanted to know whether the first side wanted to disqualify the towing from representing the second side. And Mari Buna said, why should I disqualify him? He's going to have confidential conversations telling you everything that he knows anyway. He may as well, argue with the best. And then he said he came home and he thought it over and he decided that was probably the wrong decision. He wouldn't do that again because he said that even in the secular world, they wouldn't allow these kinds of shenanigans. And what's the biggest chilul Hashem is when in the secular world, we'll look at what we do and say that's outrageous. So that's an important thing to bear in mind in terms of our stance regarding toning. But really, there are two responses that I'll just say in different words. One is that in terms of why we allow attorneys, so you can argue, that you can make an argument not to allow attorneys either. And as Rabbi Willig said, the attorneys come in different shapes. Some are more helpful than others, but we also have to be cognizant of the fact that our decisions need to be enforceable. If you didn't allow the parties to be represented by attorneys, so then the decision would not be enforceable in a secular court, and we need the decision to be enforceable because the Torah says, "Shoftim v'shotrim titem b'chol shera." You have to have shoftim, you have to have judges, but you have to have shotrim. You have to have the police officers. You have to have enforcement mechanisms of your decisions. But that still wouldn't be an adequate justification to allow something if it was really against the Torah. So the justification really is like the Rambam writes. The Rambam says we have a perpetual tension between the two different statements of Chazal. One statement is Al tasas v'chokirochay adoyonim. Don't be a lawyer. Don't allow lawyers. And the other statement is Psach picha li'ilem. You have to open up the mouths of those who are mute, those who otherwise can't express themselves. So if the main job of the attorney is, as Rabbi Willig mentioned, to just help the parties present the facts of the case, not to try to skew the law or change the facts in order to be more consistent with how halakha would play out, but just to present the simple facts of the case in a more cohesive, more comprehensive, more organized fashion in front of the Bezdin, so the Bezdin will understand what the person is really claiming. So that actually is a mitzvah. It's the job of the Bezdin to make sure that the attorneys don't go too much in a direction where they're serving more than that purpose and where they would be falsifying the facts of the case. But since the attorneys do have certain rules of professional ethics, and because for the most part, the attorneys really aren't arguing the halakha in front of the Bezdin, but they really are serving the purpose of simply organizing the presentation. Therefore, that really turns out to be the main halakha justification, so that it's not only a b'diavad, but really can be a lechatchila.
One of the other topics that's come up a little bit, Rabbi Willig, you mentioned it in some of your earlier comments, is the use of American law in Basin decision making. And there's some, you did it quickly, there are a whole bunch of subtle points in there, kind of where it slips in and where it's okay and where it's not okay and how it's used. I wonder if maybe both of you would want to elaborate a little bit, because this, I think, is Rabbi Willig, as you noted, one of the defining features in some ways of the Basin of America. Where is the proper role for American law or for the host country's law? And how do we make sure that it doesn't get to a point, if you're already letting some of that slippage in, the whole, thinking about the Isser Arkos and in its widest sense, this worry that we should have our own legal system and not adopt another legal system. How do we how does the Basin of America walk that line between those two values?
So there are two separate and distinct cases. One is a case in which the parties sign the contract, in which they say that in case of a dispute between them, that the law of the state of X should be the operative law in determining the situation. How do you view this? So our Bezdin follows the guidance of the much lamented Zalman Nechemia Goldberg, Zecher Tzadik V'Rocha, who actually wrote about this explicitly in Yeshua and said, no problem. The two parties agree, as he put it, quoted from the Gemara, Kol Tanai Shebamamon Kai. Any condition that two parties agree to is valid. Whatever reserves, Reiss was on such a case, he followed that guidance, and one of the judges took such strong exception that in a rarity, he refused to even sign the psak, even though he was outvoted. He felt the Bezdin is not just wrong, the Bezdin is in violation of the laws of our codes. He couldn't be party to that. Certainly he's entitled to his opinion, but that's not the opinion of our Bezdin. It's probably available online by now. I mentioned before, Rabbi Itamar Rosenzweig, what he does to my articles. So I wrote something about this just recently, based on an analysis of a Chuvas Rashba, which had previously been published in a Hebrew language sefer called Mordechai and Choshen Mishpat, and I wrote it in English, and he rewrote it, to say the least. It's very, very readable, even for attorneys, especially for attorneys now, in which I try to explain why, on the contrary, if you read the Rashba very carefully, there's absolutely nothing wrong with having parties explicitly accept the law of the land, with the sole exception between the laws of inheritance as they apply to blood relatives, as opposed to husband and wife. But he goes further, the Rashba. The same source that everybody quotes to go against me proves my case. Where the Rashba says that not only in the case where they explicitly state they want to be governed by secular law, but even if that's the custom, whether it's a good custom or not such a good custom, that remains to be discussed, perhaps when it's more time. But if that custom exists, and it doesn't run afoul of the issue of inheritance with respect to blood relatives, then, he writes, we have to follow that custom. It's really based upon Yerushalmi, Hakol Keminik Amedina, Minik Bevatel Halacha, which of course sometimes is misused in other areas, but it certainly applies in monetary law. And this is the view of our Bezdin. Of course, not every single case will fall into that category. There can be some Dinei Torah which are purely strict halacha, which are not necessarily based upon the meaning of the mind of the two parties, and then we can figure out what they have in mind. And then, of course, the binding halacha is Shulchan Aruch. We do not apply Dina de Machus Dina to disputes between two Jewish parties. It only gets in to, as some call it, the back door. The Dina de Machus Dina will get through the back door of its having been established as a minig Medina. And the case I described earlier, my claim to my fellow Dayanim, who are from the more Haredi establishment, was if you're right, that the parties wanted to have their disputes settled by Shulchan Aruch Choshen Mishpat, when they drew up their contract, they should have hired a rabbi to draw it up for them. No, they hired a lawyer, they hired an attorney. The same attorney who did all their contracts when they were dealing respectively with non-Jews or non-observant Jews, drew up this contract as well. And therefore, my understanding of the meaning of the minds was it should be judged exactly the same way. So therefore, once again, if it's explicit, I believe, without rare exception, the Bezdin should follow that explicit command of the parties to invoke secular law. Where it's not explicit, it depends upon the custom. What is the custom? Now, we're not gonna have time to talk about this specifically, but let's talk about equitable distribution, which is, I'm sure you know, certainly the attorneys know, is how end of marriage disputes are settled here in this country. So by strict halacha, doesn't wash. However, if it can be established, as perhaps it has been already, that in our community, how would we define our community? That nearly all of these disputes are settled either, whoever settles them, most of them are settled, they're not the final judgment. Even if it goes to court, they're mostly settled, not a final judgment. Comes to Bezdin, settled, not a final judgment. Almost all of them are settled through something which resembles equitable distribution or the shadow of a court decision of equitable distribution. So it's arguably has become the Minhag HaMedina in our part of the world, and therefore a Bezdin has the right to consider implementing a decision based upon, to some extent, equitable distribution, even in a case where the parties have not agreed to it. I should add, and this is not the topic either for today, and I'm conscious of the clock as well, that we have a prenuptial agreement, which hasn't come up at all yet, really, which now, in its most recent version, makes a specific reference to equitable distribution as a default, given the reality that that is what's happening when there is no explicit agreement. These things, of course, have to be measured and recalibrated as time goes on.
I'm guessing there isn't that much time, so I don't know how many minutes I have. Okay, good. Let me know if we're using at the end of that. Okay, sounds good. So I'll just boil it down really to three different ways in which a secular law becomes relevant in terms of the halakhic decision in a Bezdin case. The first, as Rabbi Willig mentions, is Tanai Shemamama. The parties make an explicit condition, sometimes even if it's not explicit, it's understood implicitly based on their history of dealing, that they intend the transaction to be governed according to secular law. Now, of course, as the Tashbetz points out, you can't have a Tanai Shemamama to violate an Isser. You can't have a condition we're going to violate Shabbos, or we're going to make money off of selling cheeseburgers, or we're going to enter into an agreement in which there'll be an interest-bearing transaction and we want to collect the interest. If it's something which violates the realm of Issa V'Heta, it violates ritual Jewish law, so then the condition is simply not going to be binding. So that's simply an obvious example of why it still makes a huge difference whether, when there is such a condition, the parties come in front of Bezdin and they come in front of secular court. Number one, going in front of secular court is itself a ritual prohibition. If the parties would stipulate that, like the Ramban writes, Torah, the parties stipulate a condition that they're going to go to secular courts. The Ramban says that's not considered to be a Tanai Shemamama, a condition that would be enforceable. That's a condition against the ritual prohibition. So of course that's not enforceable. But number two, the Bezdin will establish the parameters. They'll establish the limits. They'll say, well, the condition works up to a certain point, but once we get into a certain domain where there would be a ripis prohibition or something of that sort, so the Bezdin can draw the line and say, well, this we're going to enforce, but this part of the condition is not enforceable, and this we're not going to enforce. The second way in which it becomes a part of the Bezdin jurisdiction is if there's a minhag hasochrim, if there is a custom of the commercial marketplace. The Gemara talks about situta, that there are different ways in which you can consummate a transaction according to halakha, different types of kinyanim, different ways of acquiring an object. But if in a particular industry, there's a new way in which people are able to demonstrate that they have the commitment to complete a transaction. It would just be a handshake, for example, and they would say mazal u'bracha, like they do in the diamond industry. So then that would become a controlling kinyan. That would become a controlling obligation from the standpoint of halacha as well. And so too, Moshe Weinstein writes, if the custom that people follow, like in landlord-tenant transactions, is in accordance with the landlord, the tenant, the marketplace, and that happens to coincide with what is recorded in the secular law, it does not become less valid as the minhag, as the custom of the marketplace, because of the fact that it's codified in secular law. What the Rashba had said was that if the reason you're following secular law is because you want to imitate secular law, because you don't think Torah is good enough, so that's when it wouldn't be enforceable. But if you're doing it because it's the custom of the land, so then that actually becomes enforceable as a matter of halacha, and the dayanim had the responsibility to be familiar with those customs and to apply them as a matter of halacha. And the third area, of course, is dina de malchus dina. As a general rule, we say that the law of the land is not going to be applicable to transactions between two Jewish parties, but there is a little bit of an exception to that if it's something which is takanas b'nei Medina, if there is an economic regulation of a sweeping nature where if you would have two parties that would privately contract with each other to go against the economic regulation, it would disturb the entire system. Like you have a creditor and a debtor in a bankruptcy case, so where the creditor says, well, the two of us are friends, so you'll just give me a preference, you'll pay up my debt, you just won't pay up anybody else's debts, the entire system would collapse. So if you have situations like that, then dina de malchus dina can actually become a halachic standard, even with respect to two Jewish parties. But of course, you need a proper beis din to make these types of determinations.
Okay, I see we got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to pick an easy one. We got like 73 more questions for everyone. Let's talk about the prenup for a second. I'm sure we can cover this in 5 minutes, right? It's been around 25 years, Rabbi Willig, since what I would describe as one of the signature achievements of the Basin of America, under your leadership, the creation of the halachic prenup. And I'm curious if you could just reflect a little bit on its successes, some of its continued challenges, and maybe talk about it a little bit in light of the aguna problem over time, what you've seen in terms of the aguna problem, the ability of the prenup to respond. What's left to do? What work have we achieved? What work is left to do?
5 minutes or less.
Yeah, no problem.
Oh.
We have 4 minutes now.
So as a matter of fact, this last month, we, I guess, celebrated the 30th anniversary of the signatures that I received in the Holy Land after almost 2 years of hard work. I only know because of Avad Yosef Zatzal was the only one who put a date to his signature. It was Rosh Chodesh Shvat Tov Shin Nun Beis. That's 30 years ago. And I embarked upon this project because of a particular case in my own shul, where there was we'll call it an aguna case. And it just worked out. We're learning getting that year in the yeshiva, these things, Hashem works out miracles. And I said to the 6 months, the fellow wasn't allowed to come to shul, which is any of the shuls in Riverdale, which is itself an amazing achievement. I told the boys before Pesach, this is crazy. Let's do something about it. So after Pesach, we started looking. So Zalman Nechem and Gold had written something. Hashem helped. 3 days later, the judge made a decision, rewarded the husband for giving again some extra percentages, and he gave it again. We were already on our way in this endeavor. And after many phone calls and letters and a trip first in the year before, and then back to all the lawyers here in America. It's also an Orthodox Caucus project that preceded the reorganization of the Beis by 5 years. We got an enforceable working document. The document literally had 2 separate documents. That's how it's printed in the Hamadrich, which came out in 1995 by the RCA. One was a simple document of arbitration to go to Beis Din, not to go to secular court, naming the Beis Din, of course. And then number 2 was an assumption of a daily obligation, which in many cases perhaps would be binding even in strict halacha. But we did 2 things. Number 1, we quantified it, because otherwise they can fight forever about how much it is. And the original document, which is still printed there, it's a blank. After a while, we saw they fight so much, we just put a number in, which is of course an estimate. Only all numbers are estimates. There was also a blank for the name of the Beis Din. They thought about that. We put a Beis Din of America. And the assumption of obligation would be triggered by the time that the husband and wife no longer live together in the same house or apartment, which is symbolist. It was the third great Dayan Shlita who signed, and it was really his initiative to turn things around that way. It's logical. A man gets married, he's obligated to do things for his wife. Certainly the Gemara. But once she moves out, he moves out. He's no longer paying the bills. So you have to give an unaffected allowance as long as they're married. When they get divorced, of course, it terminates. So that's what it is. So therefore, what it boils down to is that if a woman feels that she's entitled to a get, she calls the Bezdin, she summons her husband to the Bezdin. Hopefully he'll come right away. If he doesn't come right away, after a few tinkerings because of experiences, she has to send him a notice, and the Bezdin can rule even in his absence, default, that he has to pay. Now it's up to $150 a day, which some say is too little, some say it's too much. Of course, it's an estimate. And this is going to hopefully be an incentive. We're not compelling him to give a get, not allowed to do that. It's an incentive. Since he's obligated to pay and he doesn't like it anymore, doesn't want to pay her, so he'll give a get. That's in a nutshell, very, very brief. Has it been successful? I believe so. I believe in nearly every case when the prenup was signed, there has not been a protracted aguna situation. Of course, it won't work in two extremes. The person has no money, so it's judgment proof. So who cares he owes money? Or he's a multi-millionaire, so he'd love to string her on till 120 for $150 a day. He'd love nothing better. So those two extreme cases, it just won't work. The arbitration part might work. This may work as a separate point. As a matter of fact, recently I was asked how successful it is. It did not make any inroads beyond our own community. None. When I first came back with his 3 signatures, I approached Rabbi Schwartzel, he signed it. I approached a man named Rabbi Liebes, who's not so well known nowadays, with a great Dayanim, he had the Igud Rabbanim, he also signed it. I went to my 2 other Dolei Torah in Brooklyn, whom I know quite well, and they both said, it's a wonderful document, but it's not going to fly by us. NIMBY, not in my backyard. Sadly, there's much blood spilled in their own community. I mean, their own yeshiva, they both come from the same yeshiva. That yeshiva was some bloody cases which could have been avoided by a prenup. Okay? Recently, a new initiative emerged from that community, having a simple arbitration agreement. No assumptions of obligation, which could run a Shachter problems according to some. Just agree to go to a bed. Now, Rabbi Moshe already has a tshuva about that. It was written to Rabbi Per Shlita from Far Rockaway. And he says, yeah, this is fine. They should just get it before they get married. If there'll be a problem, they'll go to Bezdin X. And they'll decide. That could solve so many problems in and of itself. A couple starts to fall apart. Everyone's jockeying for position. I'll go here, I'll go there. That could destroy the marriage. They say the prenup can destroy a marriage. On the contrary, it can preserve a marriage. Because if the marriage is on the rocks and everyone's worried which Bezdin to go to, they start jockeying for position, doing things which are sad, but would break up the marriage. They know in advance. If there's a problem, they're going to go to Bezdin next, and they don't have to do those things. It's a wonderful initiative. They came to me in the yeshiva to ask permission, as if I'd be insulted. There's a competing. I gave them a big bracha. Please do it. It's wonderful. And it was a few months ago, big in all the Shvacha magazine. They got a cover story about the Shvacha. No, not that. With a whole big story about it, tremendously big story. But from my understanding, I did a little bit of homework. It has yet to gain traction. Despite the haskamas of everybody, they went to all the big, they went to Shlomo Miller, who's considered the real heavy in that part of the world. He wrote a haskama, and many, many other great rabbis. Still hasn't gained traction. This indicates to me that the real objection to our prenup is one. Chodesh Osam Anatom. The Zayda didn't do it, I'm not going to do it. Which generally speaking is a good thing, but there are exceptions to that rule. Sometimes the old system, when the Zayda was around, probably lived in Europe somewhere, when there was a rabbi who ran everything, it was communal pressure, people to follow the rabbi. Today, I told you a case where someone couldn't come to any of the shuls in Riverdale. That's an exception. In most communities, you go from one shul to another shul to another shul. So there's no sanctions, there's nothing. You can get it, or you can just drop shul completely. You know, in the old days, a couple of years ago, you couldn't do that. But the government law, you had to belong to a community. You couldn't just say, I'm unaffiliated. There was no reform in those days. The rabbi had much sway, so they didn't need these kind of things. Today, I believe it's necessary. I'm over my time. Sorry. Want to give everybody a chance to talk?
Always.
Okay.
I'll be very brief. When I was the director of the Bezdin, I kept a ledger of all of the cases where there was a prenuptial agreement that the parties had signed, where again was given in a prompt fashion, facilitated by the prenuptial agreement. And I had recorded over 100 cases by the time that I left the Bezdin in 2008. And I can only imagine that since then, it's probably just proliferated astronomically and exponentially. Since that time. So it makes a huge difference when the parties sign a prenuptial agreement, and it has really resolved and prevented many scores and scores, hundreds of potential laguna problems. That's number one. Number two, I'll just mention that every now and then we'll fine tune the prenuptial agreement. There'll be changes in the law, and we'll make a little bit of a tweak. We'll make it a little stronger based on somebody's suggestion from a halakhic perspective. The person who's always, the go-to individual is invariably, Rabbi Willig Shlita. And it came to the point that there was a case the Bezdin in America had where the three Dayanim who heard the case passed in a certain way based on the prenuptial agreement, and it was appealed to Rabbi Willig. Rabbi Willig said, no, that's not really the proper application of the prenuptial agreement in this case, and he overruled. That doesn't happen so often at the Bezdin. You should know that it can happen. The appeals process is a meaningful one. He overruled the lower court on that basis, and then the party that lost the appeal appealed to the Court of Appeals of the state of Maryland, where I guess the parties lived at the time. If you want to look it up, this is the case of Lane versus Levy, and the judge looked at all the facts and said, "Why are they bothering us with this? I mean, look at this beautiful decision Rabbi Willig wrote. When it comes to prenuptial agreement, halacha to Rabbi Willig b'chol makom."
One slight correction, I did not overrule the panel. The panel voted 2-1, which is a rarity. We always try to find consensus. 2-1, wait a second. No, that's not true. You're right. But it's 2-1 against what I thought. So I guess sort of overruled, but not completely.
All right, I see we're a few minutes over time. Just want to thank Rabbi Willig and Rabbi Reiss again. Thank you everyone for joining us. And again, thank you so much to our host, Rabbi Schreier. Really wonderful to be here today, Sharon. Everyone enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you, Rabbi Schreier.